The first frost arrived without ceremony, settling across the empty fields like a thin breath of glass. It touched fences and roofs, turning every familiar shape into something strangely distant. Villagers stepped outside expecting an ordinary morning, only to feel a quiet tension in the air. Nothing looked dangerous, yet everything felt altered, as if the season itself had paused to watch them. Children studied the glittering ground with wide eyes, unsure whether to run or whisper. Adults lingered in doorways, measuring the cold with a kind of instinct that reached deeper than thought. Winter had spoken early, warning echoed. Mothers moved cautiously through their homes, brushing frost from windows that no longer held the warmth of autumn. They checked grain jars with steady hands, counting what remained and imagining how quickly it might disappear. Behind them, the hearth fire burned low, fed by logs thinner than the families preferred to admit. Every shadow in the house hinted at the months ahead, when food would shrink and choices narrow. No one said the word scarcity aloud, yet its presence filled the room like another member of the household. Winter demanded obedience. Few dared question its quiet authority. Fear waited nearby. In the fields beyond the village, frost clung to the last remnants of harvest as though claiming them for itself. Stalks once golden now bowed under a delicate sheen, their brittle shapes whispering of effort already spent. Livestock huddled near wooden fences, their breaths rising in pale clouds that dissolved too quickly in the morning air. Farmers watched quietly, noting which animals seemed strong and which might not endure the weeks ahead. Even the birds circled higher than usual, as though the land itself urged them toward warmer skies. Something deeper stirred beneath the silence. Winter was coming. Signs gathered. Older villagers read the frost with an understanding formed through years of hardship, remembering seasons when hunger pressed too close. They knew the difference between a passing chill and the first true signal of encroaching winter. Their memories carried stories not written in any chronicle, tales whispered at night about families who underestimated the cold. Each remembered frost brought its own caution, urging them to prepare before it became too late. Experience taught them that winter did not arrive in a single moment, but in subtle steps that many failed to notice. The signs rarely lied. They listened closely tonight. Children sensed the tension in quieter ways, noticing how adults paused longer before speaking or stared at the sky as though expecting answers. They pressed their hands against frozen ground, fascinated by the fragile crystals forming beneath their fingers. Some traced patterns in the frost, pretending they were maps to hidden places, untouched by cold or fear. Others followed their parents from room to room, drawn by the unspoken urgency that settled across every household. Even without understanding, they felt the world narrowing, as if winter was slowly closing its hand around the village. Change had begun. Everyone sensed it. As the sun rose, its pale light struggled to warm the ground, offering little comfort to those who hoped the frost might fade. Instead, the cold deepened, settling into corners and crevices, as though choosing the places it intended to claim. Animals grew restless, pacing near barns or retreating into shelters that no longer felt secure. The village itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see how harsh the coming season would be. Every instinct warned that the frost was not a simple event, but the first signal of a greater trial. Winter seldom forgave mistakes. Preparation meant survival. Throughout the morning, villagers exchanged quiet glances, acknowledging the truth without needing to speak it aloud. Some walked the edge of the fields, studying the patterns frost left behind, hoping to interpret its meaning. Others inspected tools and storage pits, testing what could endure the cold and what might fail unexpectedly. The frost became more than a weather shift. It was a reminder that survival required intention before scarcity arrived. Villagers understood that winter did not negotiate, and those who hesitated often paid the highest price. Action had to begin now. Delay invited deeper danger ahead. Time slipped quickly away. As frost melted slightly under the weak midday light, villagers gathered the fragments of certainty they still possessed, knowing the true cold had not yet come. They understood that the first frost carried a message, urging them to prepare for long nights when choices would shrink to nearly nothing. What they sensed in that quiet morning was not fear alone, but the beginning of a reckoning each household would soon face. The frost marked the threshold, a point beyond which preparations shifted from hopeful to urgent. And so the village braced itself. The real struggle waited ahead. Winter was watching. The shift from quiet worry to deeper unease arrived slowly. slipping into households like a draft through old wooden walls. At first, families tried to keep their voices steady, discussing the frost as if it was simply another inconvenience. Yet beneath the calm tone lay a tremor that everyone recognized. Those who rose before dawn noticed how the air clung to their skin with a sharper bite than the day before. Those who stepped outside felt the ground stiffen beneath their boots. Inside, the hearth's glow no longer spread as far across the floorboards, as if even fire feared the cold closing in. By the second day, concern turned to calculation. Families gathered near the hearth, not for warmth alone, but to measure what remained. Grain jars were lifted and shaken, the faint rattle inside revealing more truth than anyone wanted to hear. Dried vegetables were inspected, counted, and recounted. Hunters weighed how many arrows they had left, while mothers ran fingertips along the edges of storage chests to sense whether moisture threatened the food sealed within. Quiet became strategy. Every whispered conversation carried the tension of people measuring their options against the growing silence outside. It was during these hearthside meetings that the true weight of the coming winter revealed itself. People spoke softly, not wanting to wake children or stir the fear already hovering in the room. They asked themselves what could still be hunted before snow buried the forest paths, and what roots might be unearthed before frost hardened the soil too deeply. They debated which items could be bartered with neighbors, and which had become too precious to trade at all. This was not panic expressed through loud voices. It was panic expressed through steady, relentless questioning. Each answer led to another worry. Outside, the village leaders sensed their own burden settling across their shoulders. They walked the boundaries at dusk, listening not only for the movement of wildlife but for the quiet signs of danger that accompanied scarcity. Wolves drew closer when the cold sharpened, their hunger driving them toward livestock pens. Bandits emerged along trade routes when merchants grew scarce. Even the simple act of traveling to a nearby settlement became a gamble. The leaders carried these concerns back to the village, sharing warnings with the same restraint as a doctor, revealing a difficult truth. Protection required foresight now, not reaction later. As fear grew, old rituals resurfaced, rituals meant to coax safety from whatever unseen forces governed the harsh season. These practices were rarely spoken of during warmer months, yet in winter they slipped easily into daily life. Some families placed bundled herbs above doorways, believing their scent kept misfortune away. Others traced symbols onto hearthstones before lighting the first fire of the day. A few whispered ancient lines before meals, asking for endurance rather than abundance. These rituals brought a sense of order to a world unraveling under cold skies. They were small acts of hope wrapped inside larger fears. Even the rhythm of time changed as the frost deepened. Medieval life did not move by the precise ticking of any clock, but by the sounds and silences of nature. The villagers marked each day by the creaking of frozen branches, the muffled hush of snow beginning to gather, and the way the earth hardened beneath their feet. These shifting sounds carried meaning. A forest that grew too quiet warned that animals had withdrawn or perished. A wind that whistled differently across the thatched roofs signaled moisture in the air, meaning snow was near. People listened as though the land itself were speaking, offering clues to those willing to hear. Within homes, the tension of preparation grew sharper. Families began to test their resolve against the knowledge that winter might stretch longer than usual. Mothers considered how to thin soups without drawing attention, stretching meals without stirring despair. Fathers weighed whether to risk one last hunting trip into weakening daylight. Children noticed their parents' eyes lingering a little longer on the shrinking food stores, and though they didn't understand every detail, they felt the mood settling like frost along their own thoughts. Scarcity was no longer an abstract worry, it had begun to shape their daily rhythms. As the frost thickened and the cold settled deeper into the bones of the village, a quiet truth emerged. Survival required more than stored food. It required the ability to recognize danger early, to sense opportunity where others saw only frozen earth, and to act before the snow sealed off every path. The villagers understood that before winter took hold completely, they needed to face the reality of hunger with clear minds. And so, as the final hours of autumn slipped away, a new question rose in every household. A question that would guide the next chapter of their lives. How would scarcity reshape the choices they made each day, even before the first snow truly arrived? The final days of autumn arrived with a hush, the kind that settled over the village like a slow closing door. Each morning carried a bite sharper than the last, and the fields once alive with colour now bent beneath the chill. Families moved with urgency, knowing these fading days were their last chance to prepare. There was no illusion left that winter lingered somewhere far away. It had already stepped into their world, and every heartbeat of sunlight felt like borrowed time. They worked quickly, aware that once the final leaves fell, every task would become harder, colder, and far more dangerous. Smoke rose constantly from the drying sheds at the edge of the village, drifting into the sky in thin grey lines. Here, families dried thin slices of whatever harvest remained, apples cut so fine the light could pass through them, mushrooms gathered from damp forest floors, and strips of meat hung carefully by the fire so the smoke could seep into every fibre. Nothing was wasted. Even shriveled roots were peeled, sliced, and laid out on wooden racks, doomed to become bitter but edible stew thickeners in the months ahead. The air carried the mingled sense of smoke, earth, and desperation, a combination that told its own story. In these final days, creativity flourished out of necessity. Mothers combined scraps in ways they never attempted in summer. Hunters stitched old nets together to form crude traps for rabbits growing scarce. Children gathered fallen nuts with efficiency born of stern reminders. Every task felt like a gamble against time, and every moment lost felt like a small surrender. Families weighed which foods to preserve first, choosing those with higher fat, those that brought more strength, those that promised warmth even when portions shrank. Lesser foods were abandoned without remorse. Survival had a hierarchy. Hope did too. Despite the tension threading through every household, the village often gathered in shared spaces to work side by side. Under wooden awnings and behind long barns, communal drying racks stretched like skeletal structures across the open ground. Women knelt beside them, tying herbs with swift fingers while exchanging stories meant to keep spirits steady. Men salted meats together, lifting heavy cuts with grunts that echoed against the chill air. These gatherings carried an unspoken comfort. Working as one made the burden feel lighter, though everyone knew the time would come when cooperation shifted back into quiet competition. For as the days waned, each household began to compare their stores to their neighbours, glancing at baskets, counting sacks, and listening for clues in passing conversations. A family with too little grew anxious. A family with too much grew guarded. Wooden doors closed earlier each evening, and the village pathways emptied before twilight. People pretended they trusted one another completely, yet every glance toward a neighbour's shed carried a question. Everyone needed enough to endure, but no one dared draw attention to whatever hidden supplies they might have tucked away. Scarcity reshaped even the simplest interactions. The forest became a battleground of last-minute hunts. Hunters left before dawn, their footsteps muffled by fallen leaves turning crisp beneath the frost. Each tracked the same deer trails, hoping for one final catch before deep snow blocked the paths. They knew the animals sensed the season as well. Birds flew lower, squirrels vanished into hollow trees, and the deer became shadows slipping between the trees. When a hunter returned empty-handed, the silence hung heavier around the evening fire. When someone returned with a kill, it was celebrated quietly, grateful but cautious, not to stir envy. Twilight during these final autumn evenings carried a peculiar weight. The daylight faded earlier, rushing the villagers indoors before they were ready. The sun dipped low, leaving only a dim orange glow that stretched across the hills like a last farewell. Shadows lengthened quickly, and with them came memories of winters past, particularly the winters that had taken too much. Families remembered neighbours who failed to survive the cold, recalling names spoken seldom aloud. Their memories were warnings, etched deeply enough to shape every decision made during these dwindling days. Inside their homes, people worked through the evenings with a steady rhythm. Flames flickered against pots of bubbling preserves. Knives scraped against wooden boards, slicing, chopping, storing. Children fell asleep beside the hearth, while adults continued their preparations long into the night. Each jar sealed felt like a small victory. Each slab of dried meat meant one less fear whispering in the dark. Yet even as they worked, the question lingered in every mind. Which foods would become the true lifelines when the cold pushed deeper than anyone expected? These were the last moments before winter closed its hand around the village. The final stretch of preparation, the narrowing window in which survival had to be secured. But storing food was only the beginning of the challenge. As the first true winter winds approached, another truth rose quietly. Some foods nourished better than others. Some sustained strength through the deepest cold. Some remained edible long after others spoiled. Those secrets would matter more than any rack of dried herbs or sack of meagre grain. And as the villagers stepped into winter's grasp, they would soon learn which foods carried the power to keep them alive. When winter tightened its grip and the last merchant carts vanished from the roads, the village economy slipped quietly into a different shape. Coins lost their meaning. Promises became fragile things. What mattered most were the items people could hold in their hands, the foods that carried warmth or strength, the ingredients that could stretch a thin stew into something almost satisfying. In these moments, when the frost pressed against doors and the wind erased distant landmarks, an underground network of barter began to bloom. It did not appear suddenly. It formed through glances, lowered voices, and small exchanges that built on desperation, until secrecy became a necessity rather than a choice. This hidden market thrived in places most would overlook. Behind barns where the lantern light couldn't spill onto the road. In the back corners of taverns, where shadows pooled thickly enough to hide the passing of a small parcel. Under the old stone bridge where the river ran thin and half-frozen, creating just enough noise to mask a whispered agreement, families arrived with hoods pulled low, clutching bundles wrapped in cloth. A jar of preserved turnip might be exchanged for a handful of mushrooms dried before the frost. A sliver of hard cheese could purchase a bundle of herbs said to calm a sleepless child. The trades were rarely equal, but fairness mattered less than survival. Some families held monopolies over items the rest of the village barely understood. Their secrets were guarded with a devotion that bordered on superstition. One household knew how to smoke insects into a brittle, protein-rich powder that lasted longer than most meats. Another possessed the knowledge to grind tree bark into a flour that, though bitter, could stretch bread for weeks. There were whispers of a widow who crafted aged fish paste so potent that a spoonful could flavour an entire pot of broth. These rare foods circulated like legends spoken about cautiously, sought after quietly, demanded fiercely. Their owners understood their value and traded them only with those who could offer something equally precious. In these exchanges, the atmosphere shifted into something almost conspiratorial. Neighbours who greeted each other openly in summer now studied one another with careful eyes, unsure who held what secrets. Bartering required more than items. It required knowledge. Knowing who still had dried apples mattered. Knowing who still had a little honey mattered even more. Every household kept silent tallies of who possessed what, building mental maps of potential trades long before any discussion took place. Information circulated through hints and overheard fragments, weaving a fragile web of possibilities. The network thrived on these fragments, growing stronger as winter grew harsher. The negotiations themselves carried a strange tension, a blend of hope and guarded caution. Two villagers might meet behind a stable, each studying the other's bundle before revealing their own. A man might unwrap a small parcel to show a few shavings of smoked meat, only to hesitate when he noticed the desperation in the other's eyes. A woman might hold out a jar of fermented roots, her fingers tightening slightly, as if worried the wind might snatch it from her grasp. To offer too much was dangerous. To offer too little risked insult and potential isolation. Every trade reshaped relationships in subtle ways, creating alliances, grudges, debts, and quiet understandings. Yet beneath the tension was something else, a fragile sense of unity. Everyone understood that these barter networks existed because the village itself needed them. They were not official, nor were they discouraged. They simply filled the void left when normal trade collapsed under the weight of snow and silence. In these hidden exchanges, the villagers kept each other alive, even if they never spoke of it openly. They traded not only food but knowledge. How to cure meat properly, how to store roots in frozen soil, how to combine bitter herbs into something drinkable. These conversations, whispered under low wooden beams or behind half-frozen walls, carried as much value as the food itself. As the weeks passed and the frost thickened, these underground barters became the heartbeat of the winter economy, quiet, steady, concealed beneath layers of necessity and fear. And as families secured what they could, another question began to take shape in their minds. If these foods were traded in shadowed corners and protected like sacred treasures, what kinds of rare items existed beyond ordinary exchange? What foods were so valuable, so unusual, that entire clandestine marketplaces rose around them? Some foods were spoken of only in the quietest corners of medieval life, kept out of sight even when hunger pressed hardest against the door. Their existence lingered in whispers, shared between family members, as though revealing them too freely might summon misfortune. These were not the common staples that filled storage pits or hung from rafters. They were the rare, the strange, and the fiercely protected foods so vital, so potent, or so shame-tinged that families hid them as carefully as they hid their fears. In a world where winter demanded everything, secrecy became a form of survival, and certain ingredients slipped into the realm of the almost mythical. Fermented roots were among the most guarded treasures. Buried deep in earthen jars beneath floors or tucked inside hidden cellars, these roots transformed slowly in darkness, developing a pungent scent that would have startled anyone unfamiliar with their purpose. To strangers, they might appear spoiled, but to those who knew, they were powerful sources of strength, dense with energy, rich with flavors that awakened tired bodies. Families passed down the knowledge of how to prepare them with a seriousness normally reserved for sacred rites. A single misstep, the wrong temperature or too much air, could ruin an entire jar, leaving a household without one of winter's most dependable safeguards. So the jars stayed hidden, placed where only trusted hands could find them. Underground vegetables received similar protection. Some villages kept small plots known only to a few, where root crops were planted in deep soil designed to endure frost. These buried gardens provided quiet insurance against famine. The vegetables were unearthed only when all other stores dwindled. Those who depended on them guarded their locations fiercely, for a single theft could doom a family's survival. Even close neighbors were kept at a distance, given vague directions or misleading comments when they asked how certain families always seemed to endure the longest winters. Pride played a part, but so did the fear that too many footsteps would lead curious eyes to the hidden soil where life still grew beneath death-grey ground. There were stranger foods too, ingredients that modern memory barely recalls. Some were created through preservation methods so old that only fragments of the original techniques remain. Thick pastes made from ground fish and fermented grains were stored in small sealed pots. Dense cakes crafted from crushed seeds and honey hardened into blocks that lasted longer than most bread. These foods carried an aura of mystery that families nurtured intentionally. They were eaten in small, careful amounts, often after sunset, when the house felt most still. To consume them openly invited questions, and questions invited risk. Better to eat quietly, under dim firelight, allowing their strength to move through the body without attracting unwanted attention. Secrecy sometimes sprang from superstition rather than practicality. Certain foods were believed to hold protective power, capable of keeping illness away or shielding a family from misfortune. Dried herbs hung from beams were not just remedies, they were guardians. Strange broths made from rare roots were said to stir inner warmth strong enough to fend off the worst chills. Families feared that sharing such items would dilute their protection. Even mentioning them to outsiders felt dangerous, as though the magic woven into the recipe might unravel if spoken of too boldly. In these homes, preparing food bordered on ritual, ingredients were added in silence, pots were stirred in patterns inherited from generations long gone. And when the final mixture simmered, families consumed it with reverence, believing it held more than mere nourishment. Shame also played its part in secrecy. Certain foods, though valuable, carried the stigma of desperation. Eating them in the open marked a household as struggling. Some families hid these foods behind false walls or beneath loose stones, so no visitor would suspect their reliance on ingredients often associated with hardship. These hidden meals were eaten late at night, when windows were shuttered and the world shrank into a single dimly lit room. Though they provided the strength needed to endure, they reminded families of winters they had barely survived. Guarding them was not only about protection from theft, but protection from judgment. Silence shielded pride, even when famine pressed close. Yet perhaps the most compelling aspect of these secret foods was the knowledge required to create them. Recipes existed only in memory, preserved through careful teaching rather than written scrolls. A grandmother would whisper instructions to her daughter, who would one day whisper them to her own child. Measurements were taught by feel, timing learned through instinct. This passing of knowledge bound families together. Once shared, the recipe belonged to the lineage, not the world. And because each household had its own guarded techniques, the variety of hidden foods grew richer than any market could display. These culinary secrets formed an invisible tapestry across medieval life, stitched together by need, fear, pride, and devotion. The more rare the item, the more fiercely it was protected, and the more fiercely it was protected, the more valuable it became within the underground barter networks. A single jar of fermented root could secure a family's survival for weeks. A block of hardened seed cake could trade for firewood, tools, or even protection. These foods became currency not just because of their scarcity, but because of the secrecy wrapped around them. Mystery increased their worth. Uncertainty sharpened desire. But not all secret foods were hidden by choice. Some were hidden because speaking of them openly invited suspicion from local authorities. Certain ingredients, certain rituals, certain methods of preservation slipped into forbidden territory over time. And as winter deepened, the question grew sharper. Why were some foods discouraged, even banned by those who claimed to protect the village? There were foods in the medieval world that no one dared speak of openly. Ingredients wrapped not only in secrecy but in fear. Some were banned outright, while others hovered in a strange grey space where they were neither illegal nor acceptable, merely whispered about when candles burned low. These foods existed at the tense edge between survival and taboo, where hunger collided with belief. It was not the cold alone that ruled winter, it was the shadow of what one might be forced to eat when the season grew too cruel. In some villages, people claimed certain foods kept you alive. In others, they murmured that the same foods could steal something far more precious. Monasteries often led the charge in declaring certain winter practices forbidden. Monks recorded their reasons carefully, though the explanations rarely aligned with what villagers believed. A monastery might ban the consumption of a particular fermented mixture, arguing it clouded the mind and encouraged sinful dreaming. Yet behind those warnings lay a quiet recognition. Some mixtures were strong enough to stir hallucinations or disorientation when consumed on an empty stomach. Families who created these brews did so in silence, fearful that a monk's visit might reveal a pot simmering with something unholy. Even in the darkest hunger, people hesitated before swallowing anything labelled spiritually dangerous. Local leaders added their own restrictions. When winters threatened to break a region, they declared laws meant to maintain order, but these rules often tangled themselves into the daily lives of villagers in unsettling ways. Certain roots, especially those associated with winter sickness, were outlawed because they could mimic symptoms of poison. A family found preparing them could face public shame, as if their desperation risked spreading misfortune to the entire settlement. Some communities forbade the gathering of specific fungi, believed to carry the cold soul, a curse said to linger in the stomach of anyone who ate them. The roots of these beliefs were blurred, part practical fear, part ancient superstition, but the impact was real. People obeyed, even when they doubted, because winter made every risk feel sharper. Equally powerful were the customs enforced, not by leaders or monks, but by neighbours. Medieval villages watched themselves with a vigilance born from scarcity. Families noticed who gathered herbs at dusk, who carried bundles too small to be firewood, who walked toward the forest on a path usually used only by hunters. Suspicion grew quickly in winter. Certain foods, often associated with shame or desperation, triggered a sense of unease. Eating them marked a family as standing dangerously close to collapse. And when one household faltered, it threatened the whole village, for desperation had a way of spilling across boundaries. To prevent this, communities policed one another with subtle glances, quiet warnings, and, when needed, cold silence. This created a strange tension. Some ingredients were nourishing but forbidden. Others were permitted but quietly feared. A handful belonged to both categories. For instance, there were stories of a thick winter broth made from boiled seeds and bitter herbs that could keep a person warm for hours. But if the wrong herb was added, a look-alike plant growing beside the correct one, the mixture could cause fevered visions. Villagers believed the visions were the work of spirits trapped between the worlds of life and frost. Even if the broth was brewed correctly, the association lingered. Consuming it felt like inviting the unseen into one's mind. Families made it only in silence, and only when they believed no one watched. In certain valleys, people whispered of dried animal skins softened and boiled into a gelatinous broth. The practice was rarely discussed aloud, not because it was inherently dangerous, but because it carried the mark of deep poverty. Those who prepared it risked being seen as standing below the invisible line that separated struggling from broken. shame clung tightly to such foods. Even in a world shaped by hunger, there were ingredients so tied to despair that they became taboo by emotion as much as superstition. People hid these practices not out of fear of punishment, but fear of pity. The deeper winter grew, the more these forbidden edges blurred. Hunger pushed boundaries, desperation challenged beliefs. Some families broke rules, consuming foods they had avoided for generations, hoping no one would notice. They prepared them at night, extinguishing lamps so shadows could not betray them. They buried remnants in the cold earth behind their homes. Their survival depended not only on nourishment, but on secrecy, on ensuring that what they ate remained invisible to both neighbors and the authorities who claimed to protect them. And yet, even in secrecy, people remembered the stories. They remembered warnings passed down from elders, tales of families who consumed the wrong thing or dared something too taboo. Whether the stories were true mattered little. They shaped behavior, narrowed choices, and made some foods so frightening that families preferred hunger over risk. These tales, woven from fear and memory, rippled across villages like quiet storms. But the harshest winters pushed everyone to the same uneasy truth. Forbidden foods existed because someone, at some point, had resorted to them. And when the cold pressed too close, the same choices might return. That is where the next chapter takes us. Not into what families wanted to eat, but into what they were forced to consume when the edge of survival grew razor thin. The day the supplies ran out did not announce itself with chaos or noise. It arrived in a hush so complete that families felt it before they understood it. A mother reached into a grain jar, expecting the familiar weight, and found her hand sinking into nothing but dust. A father lifted the lid of a storage chest and saw only the faint imprint of where vegetables once rested. The quiet of these discoveries echoed across rooms that suddenly felt larger, emptier, and colder. By the time the sun rose fully, a strange stillness had settled over the homes. It was the stillness of acknowledgement, the moment when discomfort stepped aside and fear took its place. Parents woke earlier than usual, moving through shadowy rooms with cautious steps. They rechecked pits and jars, as though hoping the night had somehow been generous enough to restore what had been taken. They tapped clay containers, listened for sounds that never came, and brushed frost from cellar steps while swallowing the growing tightness in their throats. Some lifted lids twice, 3 times, unable to accept what they already knew. The body understands emptiness before the mind accepts it, and in those dim hours, the truth began to settle like a weight no one could lift. Elders recognized the signs before anyone else. They had lived through winters that whispered warnings early and grew merciless as the months unfolded. They gathered near the hearth, speaking softly of famine years when families survived on broth so weak the spoon struck the bottom with each sip. Their voices carried a trembling wisdom, reminding listeners that hunger was not a visitor that stayed politely at the door. It was a presence that seeped into every corner of a home. Their memories stretched long, echoing through generations, and as they spoke, the air in the room thickened with the gravity of the past. Children sensed the change long before anyone explained it to them. They watched their parents' eyes move quickly across shelves, linger too long on empty hooks, and shift toward windows as though searching for something just beyond sight. They noticed the way adults whispered instead of speaking plainly, and how conversations broke off when small footsteps approached. Even without understanding the details, the children felt the rising tension humming beneath the routine of each day. Hunger has a way of speaking without words, and even the youngest could hear its voice. Pantries once filled with bundles of greens now stood hollow, their outlines mocking the hope they once held. Grain jars, once heavy, wore cracks from seasons of use. Meat hooks swayed gently in the draught, carrying the ghost of smoked cuts that had long since been eaten. The emptiness turned these everyday objects into reminders of vulnerability. With every glance, families confronted the truth. The margin for error had vanished. Winter had taken its position, and the village would have to face it with what little remained. It was then that emergency foods made their uneasy entrance. Bark stripped from trees was pounded into flour, not pleasant, but capable of thickening a pot. Acorns were gathered, soaked, and mashed to remove bitterness, before becoming a thin paste eaten in small, reluctant spoonfuls. Bones that had already given their flavor to soups were boiled again and again, until the water turned cloudy with the last traces of nourishment they could surrender. These foods were not strange enough to be frightening, not yet, but they hinted at the direction desperation might lead. Families adapted quickly because adaptation was the only option. Mothers planned meals not around flavor, but around calories. Fathers measured how many days a single pot could be stretched. Children were taught to gather anything that looked edible near the forest edge. Even the smallest scraps were saved, repurposed, and cherished with a reverence born from necessity. Hunger removed pride as easily as frost stripped leaves from branches. Once the essentials were gone, survival replaced preference. Nightfall deepened the sense of unease. Flames in the hearth appeared smaller, shrinking against the cold pressing through the walls. The wind seemed louder, as though the village itself had become hollow enough to amplify it. Families sat closer together, sharing warmth and silence in equal measure. Every sound felt sharper, the creak of a loosening beam, the distant call of an animal searching for food, the faint rumble of empty stomachs echoing across the room. Hunger became a companion, unwelcome yet impossible to dismiss. As days passed, the need for more pushed its way into every conversation. Emergency foods dulled hunger but did not quiet it. Bellies ached even after bowls were emptied. Energy faded, work slowed. Each household felt the cold tightening, not just around their homes, but around their options. There was no pretending anymore. The first line of defense had been tested and found painfully thin. These early measures bought time, nothing more. The deeper cold was coming, and the first layer of desperation had already taken hold. In this moment, a new truth emerged, heavy and inescapable. When the ordinary stores failed and the emergency foods thinned, families would be forced to look beyond familiar ingredients. They would have to consider foods they once avoided, ingredients they never imagined swallowing, and methods of survival that blurred the boundary between resourcefulness and despair. And as winter pressed closer each night, one question lingered in every household. What happens when even the early sacrifices are not enough, and hunger demands something stranger still? There came a point in every brutal winter when pride thinned faster than the rations that once kept it alive. Families who swore they would never sink to certain foods suddenly found their hands reaching for ingredients they had ignored during better seasons. Hunger did not simply sharpen appetite, it reshaped the boundaries of what the human mind allowed itself to consider edible. And so, as the cold tightened and the early emergency foods dwindled, medieval households turned toward the things they never wanted others to see or even know about. Dried weeds were often the first of these shame-touched foods. In late autumn, some families quietly gathered handfuls of tough, stringy plants from the edges of fields. These weeds held little flavor and even less nourishment, yet when boiled long enough, they softened into something that resembled food. Their bitterness clung to the tongue, but the warmth they offered gave the illusion of strength. People prepared them cautiously, always in small amounts, and always at night when no one could observe the unpleasant steam rising from the pot. These meals were swallowed quickly, gratitude and embarrassment tangled together in every bite. Old animal hides were another resort, though people rarely admitted it. When softened in water for hours or even days, a strip of dried hide released a faint gelatin that thickened a weak broth. It offered no pleasure, no satisfaction, only the sense that something had passed the lips and reached the stomach. Villagers avoided looking at one another while preparing these mixtures. Even children understood the silence required. The crackling smell of boiling hide carried a shame all its own, drifting through homes with a weight that lingered long after the pot was emptied. Ground bone powder became a grim staple when the last scraps of meat had long disappeared. Bones already boiled to exhaustion were dried and crushed into coarse dust. This powder could be added to soups to create a cloudy thickness, something heavy enough to trick the body into sensing nourishment. It was the kind of food that left traces between teeth, reminding those who consumed it how close they stood to the edge of true famine. Families prepared bone powder quietly, often after neighbors had gone to sleep, the scraping of stone against bone echoing like a confession no one wanted heard. Even roots meant for livestock found their way into human hands. Turnips twisted and knotted, thick with fibers impossible to chew, were boiled until they softened just enough to swallow. These roots carried a faint, earthy sweetness that hinted at nourishment without truly offering it. They filled the stomach for a short while, but their association with hunger made them foods people consumed under the cover of night. Doors stayed shut, lamps burned low, families ate slowly, hoping the darkness might hide the desperation etched into their movements. In better times, these foods had been symbols of hardship. To rely on them was to admit collapse. And yet in winter's longest stretch, they became lifelines, small, unsteady, but essential. What made them difficult was not their taste or texture, but the way they revealed a truth people tried to hide. Hunger stripped away illusions, but shame clung stubbornly to the edges of every household. Neighbors met with polite smiles in daylight, each pretending their meals were still respectable, each silently wondering if others had already crossed into the territory of desperation. This was why families often ate these foods in near darkness. The dim light softened the sight of what lay in the bowls. Shadows erased the details of each bite. Eating became a private ritual, something protected by silence rather than shared conversation. Children learned early not to ask questions. Adults ignored the instinct to apologize for ingredients they once would have thrown to pigs. Their quiet was not only about fear of judgment, it was about avoiding the emotional weight of acknowledging how far the winter had pushed them. Chroniclers rarely documented these meals. They preferred to write about feasts, celebrations, and the resilience of communities, rather than the grim realities found inside emptying homes. To record such foods would be to admit failure of harvests, leadership, and providence, and so the most desperate ingredients were erased from the official story. What survived instead were faint rumors, fragments of local memory, and the unspoken knowledge passed through generations like a secret too heavy to carry openly. But the silence that surrounded these foods did something else. It created a hidden world of survival practices that went unrecorded, unshared, and nearly forgotten. These foods existed in the shadows of history, leaving only traces in folklore and whispered accounts. Their absence from written records gives this era a strange emptiness, as though the winters themselves conspired to hide what truly happened. And yet, in that absence, a deeper mystery emerges. If families turned to such ingredients only when hunger loosened their last hold on pride, what happened when even these reluctant meals failed to sustain them? How far would winter push them when desperation moved from shame into danger itself? In the most unforgiving winters, medieval families reached a point where the difference between survival and danger narrowed to a single breath. Food no longer fell cleanly into categories of safe or unsafe. Instead, entire meals balanced on the thin edge between nourishment and poison. Some ingredients carried risks that everyone knew too well, yet when faced with starvation, the impossible became thinkable. What mattered was not taste or comfort, but the fragile hope that a dangerous meal might offer one more night of warmth, one more morning with a beating heart. Families learned to weigh that hope carefully, listening to both instinct and memory as they approached ingredients once unthinkable. Winter, after all, blurred lines in ways nothing else could. Mildly toxic berries were among the first of these perilous choices. In summer, children were warned to avoid them, reminded that even a handful could bring a crushing sickness. But winter twisted the meaning of danger. Families who understood the secrets of these berries knew they could be transformed if boiled repeatedly, the water poured away each time to draw out their poison. The process required precision and patience. One mistake would turn the pot into a quiet threat. Yet those who mastered it preserved a source of energy capable of carrying them through the harshest stretches. When bowls filled with the softened berries, families ate slowly, aware that each bite held both promise and risk. Fungal growth scraped from cellar walls offered another strange lifeline. In warmer months, these patches of pale, velvety mold were signs of poor upkeep, something to be removed quickly and forgotten. But during famine, the same growth was collected carefully with knives or wooden spoons. Some strains were harmless when dried and cooked, adding a faint, earthy presence to weak broths. Others, nearly identical in appearance, carried toxins that could bring dizziness or fever. Identifying the safe from the unsafe required an instinct sharpened by necessity. Families learned which colors, textures, and scents to trust through stories passed down across generations. Searching for the right fungi became an intimate ritual, a silent prayer that the cellar would offer its quiet blessing rather than its hidden curse. Even spoiled meat, under certain conditions, could be coaxed back into suitability. Fermentation, one of the oldest forms of preservation, created a strange alchemy when practiced in deep winter. Meat that had turned soft or sour could sometimes be revived through careful salting, smoking, or sealing in clay pots where the cold slowed decay and encouraged a controlled transformation. The resulting food was strong, pungent, and often unsettling to those who were not accustomed to it. But for families who lived through the longest winters, such meals became the dividing line between collapse and endurance. A single pot could sustain them for days, though the scent filled the home with an uneasy reminder of how close they stood to danger. Rare medieval manuscripts reference these choices in guarded language, warning of winter poisons and the creeping illness known as hunger sickness. Scholars today debate the exact meaning of these terms, but villagers understood them intimately. Winter poisons referred not just to toxic ingredients, but to the slow damage caused when the body consumed too many desperate foods. Hunger sickness was the body's collapse when it had been fed, but not nourished, surviving on substances that filled the stomach without restoring strength. These manuscripts hinted at remedies lost to time, noting herbs that soothed the belly, or broths that steadied the mind after a risky meal. Their pages carry shadows of forgotten wisdom, written by hands that knew the stakes of winter survival far too well. To eat such foods required more than knowledge. It demanded bravery, the kind forged from watching children weaken or elders fade beneath blankets. Every decision carried weight. Families sat around dim fires, debating whether a questionable ingredient might buy them another day. Some argued against it, unwilling to risk the consequences. Others insisted the risk was worth taking. Ultimately, the choice belonged to whoever held the pot, stirring its uncertain contents while the wind roared outside like a reminder of the world's indifference. These meals tasted of fear and hope in equal measure. And yet, despite their dangers, these foods saved lives. They carried families across the harshest stretches of winter, sustaining them long enough for the world to thaw and the first green shoots to emerge. Their legacy lives quietly in fragments of folklore and half-remembered recipes, reminders that survival sometimes requires stepping into shadows others fear to enter. But dangerous foods were only one path. There were other ingredients, rarer, more carefully guarded, that households protected with fierce devotion. Soon, families reached for the foods they guarded most closely, ingredients reserved for dire moments, opening the path to secrets explored in the next chapter ahead. In the coldest regions of the medieval world, survival depended not only on what a family gathered, but on what they managed to keep hidden. Beneath the worn floorboards of simple homes, behind loose stones in the foundation, or carved into the slope of a hill just beyond the back wall, there existed secret cellars known only to the people who depended on them. These spaces were not marked on records or mentioned in casual conversation. They were whispered about only when doors were locked and candles burned low. Each cellar was a silent promise, an insurance policy against winters that showed no mercy. To reach these hidden rooms, one often had to lift a carefully placed plank or crawl through a narrow gap that ordinary eyes would overlook. The air inside always felt different, cool, still, touched with the scent of the earth itself. Dirt walls held the cold like a memory, and moisture clung to every surface, forming beads that glistened when the flame of a single tallow candle flickered to life. Light barely reached the corners, leaving shadows to guard whatever the family kept there. Shelves lined the walls in uneven rows, built by hands more concerned with survival than symmetry. Jars rested upon them, their shapes blurred beneath layers of cloth meant to conceal their contents even if someone stumbled upon the cellar. Families kept these places hidden because secrecy was protection. They feared thieves, of course neighbors driven by their own desperation, but they also feared the judgment of others. Accusations of hoarding could turn a village against a single household. Local authorities sometimes enforced strict rules on winter supplies, demanding that food be shared openly among the community. But hidden beneath the surface of cooperation simmered an understanding. Not every family could risk complete transparency. Having a secret store was not greed, but caution born from generations of losses. The cellar under the house became a sanctuary, built from equal parts fear and foresight. Inside these cellars, the rarest foods waited. Some jars held concentrated broths, dark as soil, made from simmered bones and herbs, condensed into thick liquids that could revive a starving body with only a few spoonfuls. These broths were precious, condensed nourishment, stored for moments when weakness threatened to overtake a household. Nearby sat clay pots sealed with wax, containing potted meats preserved through ancient methods few remembered in full. The meat rested beneath layers of fat, cold and firm, its scent trapped inside until opened on a day when desperation outweighed caution. Grains preserved through forgotten techniques occupied another corner. They were kept in narrow sacks or leather pouches, carefully tied to prevent moisture from seeping in. These grains were different from the common stores kept above ground. They had been treated by hand, dried slowly, sometimes smoked lightly, and stored in conditions that protected them from insects, rot, and the harsh breath of frost. Their longevity made them invaluable. A handful could thicken a soup or fill a child's stomach enough to keep them steady for another day. Not all cellar foods were physical comfort. Some were relics of knowledge carried through generations, ingredients prepared in ways modern memory has nearly lost. A bitter paste made from crushed seeds and honey. A fermented mixture so pungent it had to be opened sparingly. A dense cake of dried fruits and animal fat, wrapped in cloth to hide its strong, almost metallic scent. These foods were rarely mentioned in daylight conversations because they were not meant for ordinary use. They belonged to emergencies, to nights when the fire burned low and a family's strength faltered. Even inside these hidden spaces, families behaved quietly. The cellar demanded reverence. Candles were lit only briefly, and jars were handled with deliberate care. Children were told of the room only when old enough to understand its importance and the danger of revealing its existence. Some households had rituals before entering, simple gestures, like touching the floor before lifting the plank, or whispering a word of thanks before sealing the cellar again. Superstition intertwined with necessity, forming a protective veil over the food stored below. Over time, these hidden cellars became symbols of a deeper truth. The line between survival and collapse often rested on secrets. Families did not flaunt these reserves, nor did they boast of their preparedness. Instead, they carried the knowledge quietly, relying on it only when the world above became too cold, too barren, too unforgiving to sustain them. And though the cellars were built from simple materials, their contents held a weight that felt almost mythical. For some foods stored in these shadows were so rare, so carefully guarded, that their presence bordered on legend, and it is those almost mythical ingredients that the next section gently reveals. In every village touched by brutal winters, there were whispers of foods that seemed to defy the rules of hunger. These were not ordinary ingredients or simple provisions stored away for cold nights. They were creations spoken of with a cautious reverence, believed to carry properties beyond normal nourishment. Families called them miraculous, not because they understood their workings, but because in the bleakest months, these foods kept people standing when logic suggested they should have fallen. They existed in that uncertain space between fact and folklore, where survival mingled with wonder, and where the coldest nights left room for old stories to feel true again. One such marvel came in the form of high-fat rendered mixtures. Crafted from scraps of meat and layers of animal fat, these dense, calorie-rich blends were cooked slowly over low fires until they transformed into something thick, pale, and astonishingly durable. A spoonful could warm a chilled body, and a handful could carry a worker through hours of labor when everything else had run out. They were rarely made openly. Families stirred these mixtures at night, adding herbs, marrow, and bits of preserved root with motions practiced in hushed kitchens. Their scent carried far, so windows were shuttered and fires banked low. No one wanted the neighbors to know what miracles simmered behind closed doors. Even more legendary were the everlasting stews pots that never fully emptied, simmering for weeks or months at a time. Into these cauldrons went everything a family could spare: bones, roots, dried greens, bits of meat, and occasionally a rare scrap from the hidden cellar. The pot stayed on the hearth constantly, its flavor deepening day by day as new ingredients merged with the older base. People swore the stew grew stronger with time, as if each addition layered another strand of endurance into the mixture. Visitors claimed they felt restored after a single bowl, and though no one could explain why, the belief persisted. Some families treated the ever-simmering pot like a guardian presence, tending it with devotion. Preserved organ meats also carried reputations that bordered on the mystical. Through meticulous curing and sealing methods, certain families crafted organ mixtures that could last for years. These were used sparingly, often reserved for the sick or the frail. A single slice was believed to revive strength quickly, restoring color to pale cheeks and steadiness to trembling hands. Whether the effect came from dense nutrients or the belief surrounding them, no one could say, but the stories endured. Elders told of winters when a small jar of organ paste saved whole households, its contents stretched thin but still powerful enough to turn weakness into survival. Some miracle foods drew admiration because of their ability to protect against illness. Thick brews made from root extracts, honey, and rendered fat were said to ward off fevers. Families prepared them in careful batches, storing them in small jars hidden away from curious eyes. These brews appeared in stories more often than in documents. Chroniclers avoided referencing what could not be easily explained, leaving modern memory with only fragments of their existence. Yet within villages that faced winter's harshest blows, the belief in these mixtures remained firm. People trusted them because history unwritten, whispered, carried between generations, told them they worked when nothing else could. Other foods were praised for their uncanny longevity. Certain dried cakes, formed from seeds, nuts, and preserved berries, hardened into bricks that could remain edible far beyond a single season. They were dry, dense, difficult to chew, and unremarkable in taste, yet they sustained travellers crossing desolate paths when nothing else could be relied upon. Villagers claimed these cakes could keep a person alive for days, with only small bites taken at a time. Because they required rare ingredients and long preparation, they were rarely traded. Instead, they passed quietly from one family member to another, stored carefully in cloth bundles, and revealed only when the world outside offered nothing but hunger. What made these foods miraculous was not only their resilience or nutritional value, but the mythology wrapped around them. They represented a different kind of survival, one woven from tradition, secrecy, and a willingness to trust in knowledge that had no written home. Families treated these foods as lifelines, talismans crafted in kitchens rather than carved in stone. They were consumed slowly, almost ceremonially, as if acknowledging the generations embedded within each bite. Recipes for these miracle foods rarely appeared in manuscripts, not because they lacked importance, but because they belonged to the intimate realm of family memory. To write them down was to risk losing control over them. The power of the recipe resided in who held it, who kept it safe, and who decided when it could be used. In many ways, the miracle foods existed not only in jars or pots, but in the trust that bound a family together through winter's worst threats. As famine deepened and days shortened, the value of these foods grew beyond nourishment. They became symbols of hope, of resilience, of secrets too important to share widely. Their protection was a task taken seriously, wrapped in caution and ritual. Families created hidden spaces and silent agreements passed between generations. The value of these foods extended beyond hunger. They were pieces of identity guarded as treasured inheritance. And if these foods held such power, the next question became inescapable. How did families keep them safe from the world outside their doors? In a world where winter could unmake a family within weeks, knowledge became as valuable as any hidden cellar or precious jar of food. But unlike grain or meat, knowledge could not be stored in sacks or buried beneath the floorboards. It had to be protected differently, carried in memory, guarded in silence, and passed down only when the moment felt right. Recipes that kept families alive through the hardest winters were often never written, not because ink was scarce, but because secrecy was part of their power. A written recipe could be stolen. A whispered one could be controlled. These guarded techniques formed an invisible lineage, stretching back through generations. A grandmother teaching her daughter how to prepare a thick survival broth did so under moonlight, long after the rest of the house had fallen asleep. The lesson was whispered rather than spoken aloud, as though the night itself might betray them if the words carried too far. The daughter watched carefully, memorizing each pinch of herb, each stir of the pot, each moment when the mixture shifted from mere food to something capable of sustaining a body through bitter cold. The recipe was not just a list of ingredients, it was a ritual, a thread of family identity woven through time. Some instructions were encoded in gestures rather than words. A tap on the rim of a bowl indicated the correct consistency. A silent nod marked the moment a mixture was ready. In certain families, recipes were hidden in lullabies or disguised as small superstitions, steps that, on the surface, seemed odd but held meaning for those taught to read them. These layers of secrecy existed not out of paranoia, but out of necessity. If too many people learned the technique, it would lose its advantage in winter. Scarcity made even knowledge a guarded currency. The tension between secrecy and survival shaped how families taught their chosen heirs. A parent might choose only one child to learn a certain recipe, ensuring that the knowledge remained contained. Sometimes this caused envy among siblings, though more often it created a sense of responsibility. The chosen one understood that safeguarding the recipe meant safeguarding the family's future. They were entrusted with something fragile, a technique honed by ancestors who had stared hunger in the face and refused to let it win. During harsh winters, this secrecy carried its own burden. When neighbors grew desperate, some families struggled with the choice of sharing their guarded methods. Sharing a recipe could save a life, but it could also deplete the family's advantage when survival demanded every edge. Many compromised by sharing food created through the recipe while keeping the process itself hidden. It was a delicate balance between compassion and caution, shaped by the understanding that winter threatened everyone, but not everyone would survive it. The way these recipes were preserved also contributed to their mystique. Because they weren't written down, details shifted slightly through the generations, creating variations that blended practicality with superstition. One household might add a specific herb for strength. Another insisted on stirring only with a wooden spoon carved from a particular tree. Over time, these differences became part of the lore surrounding the recipe, binding it to the family that protected it. As centuries passed, many of these oral techniques vanished from common knowledge. Without records, later generations dismissed the stories surrounding them as exaggerations or myths, curious tales about foods capable of reviving the weak or enduring impossibly long winters. Scholars reading old manuscripts found hints of these methods, but seldom the full picture, leading them to treat the references as folklore rather than fact. Yet in quiet corners of rural villages, some of the recipes persisted, handed down by families who still honored the weight of ancestral wisdom. These survival techniques serve as a reminder that the medieval world depended not only on what could be gathered, stored, or hunted, but on what could be remembered. Knowledge was a living thing that moved through households like a ghost, seen only by those chosen to witness it, felt more than understood. And while these rare recipes helped families endure from within their homes, they offered no protection against the scarcity that lay beyond their walls. For as winter deepened, even the most carefully guarded secrets became useless if families could not access the world outside, a world where the hunt for food grew colder, riskier, and more uncertain with each passing day. Winter hunting was a test that demanded more than strength or skill. It asked for stillness, an almost unnatural quiet that few could maintain for long. The frozen world amplified every breath, every shift of weight, every whisper of cloth brushing against bark. Hunters stepped into this silence with the understanding that one misstep could send potential prey fleeing into the depths of the forest, leaving a family to face another hungry night. The snow did not forgive mistakes. It carried sound like water carries heat, and even the faintest crunch beneath a boot could unravel hours of careful tracking. Hunters prepared by studying the snow before taking a single step. Fresh tracks offered clues, the sharp, deliberate prints of a deer, the staggered marks of an injured animal moving slowly, or the tight zigzag of a rabbit fleeing from something unseen. Sometimes the snow revealed more than tracks. A broken twig, a tuft of fur caught on bramble, or a patch of disturbed frost could hint at the direction an animal had fled. Hunters learned to read these signs the way scholars read manuscripts, each detail guiding them deeper into the woods. But the forest in winter was a deceptive place. Sounds travelled strangely, bending around trunks and bouncing off ice-coated branches. A rustle could seem close when it came from far away, or distant when it was only a few paces ahead. Hunters had to move slowly, listening with patience sharpened by necessity. They paused often, holding their breath to catch faint cues. The soft thump of hooves pressing into snow, the delicate scrape of a small creature digging beneath the frost for food, or the distant warning call of birds unsettled by movement. Every sound was a map, and every pause an opportunity to understand it. Hunting in winter carried a danger beyond hunger. Thin ice lay hidden beneath drifts, concealing ponds that could swallow a careless step. Ravines were covered by deceptively smooth blankets of snow, ready to collapse under weight. Predators roamed, equally desperate and equally alert. Wolves followed many of the same tracks humans did, testing the air with the same hunger, their yellow eyes watching from between trees. Hunters knew they were not alone out there. Sometimes they felt the forest watching, listening, measuring them just as carefully as they measured it. Because the hunt was so treacherous, medieval hunters often turned to small rituals before venturing out. Some touched the tips of their arrows to the cold earth, believing it honored the spirits of the forest. Others whispered charms into the sleeves of their coats, hoping luck would hide them from danger or guide their steps toward prey. These gestures did not guarantee success, but they offered a sense of grounding in a world that felt unpredictable. When the cold pressed hard and food ran thin, even the practical-minded embraced the comfort of small traditions. Once a trail appeared promising, hunters followed it with a rhythm so slow and controlled it resembled a kind of moving meditation. Each step required thought: where to place the foot, how to distribute weight, whether the snow ahead seemed too shallow or too thick. In this frozen world, everything mattered. A startled deer could vanish into the white blur of trees with astonishing speed, leaving nothing but silence in its wake. And yet, catching even a single rabbit or bird could mean the difference between a family going to bed, hungry or fed. The loneliness of these hunts was sharp. Hunters walked for hours without hearing another human voice, surrounded only by the soft groan of shifting ice or the distant moan of wind pushing through branches. The forest felt endless, its quiet stretching into something almost ancient. Time lost its edges. A hunter might follow a trail for so long that the prints began to fade into drifting snow, forcing a decision: continue deeper or turn back. Going deeper carried the risk of losing one's bearings. Turning back meant returning home empty-handed. But the stakes left little room for hesitation. Every animal, no matter how small, held value. The meat brought warmth, the fat brought strength, the bones offered broth, tools, and glue. Even the hide could be used to mend clothing or patch old boots. Hunters learned to value not just the chase, but every part of the creature they sought. Winter did not allow waste. As daylight thinned and the sky deepened into grey, hunters often faced their hardest choice: whether to push a little farther or retreat to safety. Many followed their instincts, trusting the quiet signs the forest offered. Sometimes the final effort led to success: a squirrel darting too late, a bird roosting low, a deer slowing at the edge of a clearing. Other times, the forest remained stubbornly silent. And yet, whether the hunt succeeded or failed, the winter world held one constant truth: the forest was not the only place where food hid beneath the cold. Beneath the frozen lakes, another source of life waited in the dark waters below, offering possibilities the forest could not. Winter lakes held a silence unlike anything found in the forest. Their surfaces froze into wide, pale mirrors that reflected the sky so perfectly that it became difficult to tell where the world ended and where its reflection began. Beneath that frozen skin, however, life continued slow, muted, and strangely resilient. Medieval families knew that when the forest offered little and the fields lay empty, the frozen lakes guarded secrets that could mean survival. But reaching those secrets required patience, precision, and a kind of quiet bravery that only hunger could teach. Villagers approached the frozen lake with tools worn smooth by generations of use. Blades sharpened carefully by firelight sliced into the ice with steady, practiced rhythm. Each strike echoed across the surface, bouncing off distant shores like the call of a wandering spirit. The ice resisted at first, groaning in deep, unsettling tones that suggested it would rather remain unbroken. But eventually, a thin crack appeared, widening with each careful blow until a dark circle of open water revealed itself. Steam rose faintly from the blackness below, carrying the scent of something ancient and cold. Once the hole was opened, the true work began. Some families lowered woven baskets weighted with stones, allowing them to sink slowly until they touched the lake bed. Others used simple lures crafted from feathers, bone shards, or bits of reflective metal techniques so old that no one remembered who first taught them. These lures swayed gently in the dark water, mimicking movements of small creatures that fish still chased despite the season's grip. Children watched in breathless silence, their eyes fixed on the small ripples marking the line between frozen stillness and hidden life. Winter fishing demanded patience. Fish moved slowly beneath the ice, their bodies conserving energy, their paths ambiguous and unhurried. A basket might remain submerged for hours before a tug signaled success. A line might hang motionless for an entire afternoon, testing a family's resolve. But when a catch finally broke the surface, it brought a surge of relief that warmed even the coldest hands. Fish were among the most reliable winter foods, not plentiful, but steady. And more importantly, nothing went to waste. The meat provided nourishment, stripped clean, and cooked in thin stews that spread warmth through the body. The bones were simmered into broth or dried and crushed to strengthen weak soups. Heads, often discarded in times of abundance, were boiled until every scrap of collagen melted into a rich, sustaining liquid. Even the skins were used, sometimes dried and chewed like hard leather, sometimes added to bubbling pots where they softened into something edible. In winter, the lake gave nothing frivolous. Every part of its offering held value. But fish were not the only gifts hidden beneath the ice. Medieval villagers understood that frozen lakes sheltered other, lesser-known foods capable of sustaining life. Thin strands of cold-resistant algae clung to underwater rocks, their vibrant green dulled by the season, but still rich with nutrients. Gathering them required daring, especially when ice cracked along the edges of the fishing hole. Yet these algae, once boiled briefly, added essential depth to soups that otherwise tasted like little more than warmed water. Small crustaceans, tiny, almost translucent, were scooped from the edges of baskets lowered to the lake bed. These creatures, overlooked in warmer months, became precious in winter. When dried and crushed, they lent a faint but welcome savouriness to meals. Some villagers sprinkled them into stews. Others mixed them with grain to create small cakes that held surprising strength despite their modest size. Medieval chroniclers rarely mentioned these details, but families who lived near lakes knew them well. Their knowledge, passed quietly through generations, formed a hidden chapter of winter survival. Certain water plants also endured the season through a process few fully understood. Repeated freeze-thaw cycles softened them in ways that made them edible when properly prepared. Villagers who recognized these plants harvested them with wooden hooks, pulling long strands from the cold depths. These plants were dried, stored, or cooked immediately, providing a unique texture that thickened soups and brought a subtle taste of earthiness. Like the crustaceans and algae, their value lay not in abundance but in their reliability. The lake never offered much, but it offered something, and in winter, something mattered deeply. The methods used to harvest these foods varied from village to village. Some communities relied heavily on baskets, others preferred lures shaped like small fish. In certain regions, hunters carved long channels into the ice, herding fish towards small exit holes. These techniques were so specialized that they vanished over centuries as winters grew milder and traditions shifted. What remains of them now lives only in fragments of folklore and the quiet intuition of families who still practice winter fishing by hand. There was a serenity to these frozen harvests. The lake, despite its danger, felt like a place where time moved differently. Standing upon its surface, surrounded by endless white and blue, one could sense the weight of history pressing beneath the ice. Every catch felt like a gift from a world both familiar and strange. Hunger turned these moments into lifelines, but the mystery surrounding them gave them an almost sacred quality. Yet even as the lake sustained life, its offerings were limited. No one relied solely on the frozen waters. When fish grew scarce, or baskets returned empty too many days in a row, families looked elsewhere toward the forests, the fields, and places less expected. The hunt for food expanded beyond animals and fish, moving into territories so strange and uncertain that even winter veterans approached them with caution. Now, the search shifted toward elements of the landscape few would imagine as edible, yet in desperate times, they, too, became part of the winter feast. When the forests fell silent and the lakes surrendered their last offerings, medieval families turned their attention to places no one would consider generous. Winter revealed a different landscape, one where the world appeared empty at first glance, yet held fragile traces of nourishment for those who knew where to look. Trees, stones, insects, and shadows became unlikely allies. Survival demanded creativity, and families who understood the hidden potential of these strange foods often endured when others faltered. Hunger sharpened senses, but ancient knowledge guided hands. Tree sap, hardened by cold, was one such discovery. During winter, certain trees released thin ribbons of sap that froze almost instantly into pale shards, resembling brittle amber. Children were often the first to notice them, tapping the edges with curious fingers until a piece broke free. These hardened strips tasted faintly sweet, carrying just enough energy to lift spirits on a bleak day. Families gathered them quietly, placing the shards in small cloth pouches, as though collecting precious stones. Some believed these frozen sweets carried protective warmth, especially for the young or sick. Others treated them as sacred treats, a reminder that even the harshest season could still offer small mercies. Inside cellars, Winter fungi emerged in secret corners, clinging to damp beams and stone walls. Many dismissed these growths as unwelcome signs of moisture, but certain families recognized the varieties that could be dried, crumbled, and added to soups. These fungi were not the familiar mushrooms of autumn. They were delicate, pale, and easily damaged by careless hands. Gathering them required a steady touch and an understanding of which varieties were harmless and which were best avoided. Those who mastered this skill harvested the fungi by lantern glow, scraping them into wooden bowls while whispering quiet, thanks to whatever force allowed such life to grow underground during the coldest nights. Moss scraped from forest stones provided another surprising source of sustenance. At first glance, the idea seemed unthinkable, even to those accustomed to winter hardship. Yet certain mosses, especially those growing on the southern faces of large stones, carried minerals and faint traces of energy that could bolster weakened bodies. Families collected them in small bundles, boiling them until they softened into a thick paste. The texture was unusual, slippery, gritty, and unlike anything else in their diet, but it filled the stomach, and in winter, fullness mattered more than preference. Some elders believed these mosses carried healing properties, strengthening bones or calming feverish minds. Others claimed the moss connected those who consumed it to the land itself, grounding them through the long, dark months. Insects, too, played an unexpected role in survival. Though many today might recoil at the thought, medieval families understood that insects offered valuable protein when other sources vanished. During winter, beetles and larvae hid beneath bark or burrowed into soft, decaying wood. Children helped gather them, prying loose pieces of bark to reveal small pockets of life beneath. The insects were dried near the hearth, turning crisp and light. Some were ground into powder and mixed with flour to stretch bread. Others were roasted and added to thin stews to provide a much-needed richness. Eating insects carried a mark of desperation, and families rarely spoke of it openly, yet they recognized the strength it offered. Pride faltered when hunger called loudly enough. There were even stories of families boiling certain lichens scraped from tree trunks, hard, crusty patches that softened when soaked overnight. While not pleasant in taste, these lichens thickened soups and helped maintain energy when food was scarce. Their preparation required caution. Some varieties caused stomach pains or hallucinations if handled incorrectly. Knowledge of which was safe became a guarded family skill, shared only with those old enough to respect its importance. The line between helpful and harmful blurred so easily during winter, and those who misjudged it suffered dearly. Beyond the physical nourishment, many of these unusual foods carried cultural significance. Frozen sap was viewed as a blessing. Fungi from cellar walls were treated with a mix of respect and caution, as though they belonged to a world just beyond human sight. Moss held spiritual weight in certain regions, believed to protect families from illness or misfortune when consumed during winter festivals. Even insects were sometimes spoken of in hushed tones, referred to as the forest's smallest gifts, a phrase that softened the discomfort of eating them. These beliefs mattered not because they could be proven, but because they offered comfort during the harshest season. Winter isolated families, forced them into tight spaces where fear and hunger pressed heavily on the mind. Finding meaning in the smallest things helped them endure. A shard of frozen sap became a promise. A bowl of moss stew became a shield. A handful of dried insects became a reminder that life persisted even when the world seemed still. These unexpected foods revealed something essential. Medieval survival was not a matter of strength alone. It required curiosity, intuition, and an intimate relationship with the natural world. Families who understood these hidden offerings saw the landscape differently. They saw possibility where others saw emptiness. They saw quiet, stubborn life clinging to stones, trees, and shadows. And this connection to the natural world ran deeper than instinct. It formed a kind of knowledge, one carried not in books, but in memory and experience. A knowledge that guided families through winters that sought to erase them. As the chapter closes, the question grows unavoidable. If families could gather food from such unlikely places, what other hidden gifts did nature offer during winter's most unforgiving nights? The next chapter explores that deeper bond, revealing how medieval survival depended not just on gathering food, but on knowing the world's secrets and listening to its quiet language. In winter's quiet grip, when the land appeared stripped of life, a different kind of abundance waited beneath the frost. Medieval families who knew where to look understood that the cold did not silence every living thing. Some plants, small and unassuming, endured the season with a stubborn strength that mirrored the people who relied on them. Long after the fields hardened and the forests fell still, winter plants continued their secret work, storing energy in roots and bulbs hidden safely beneath the frozen surface. To those who understood this hidden world, the season felt less like a void and more like a secret kept by the earth itself. Foragers stepped into the winter world with practiced eyes, reading clues the untrained would miss. The shape of last season's dried stems hinted at what might still survive just beneath the ground. A cluster of brittle leaves revealed where winter cress rooted itself, ready to offer a sharp, invigorating bite even in the coldest months. Footprints left by small animals often led to hidden patches of edible greens, as creatures knew instinctively where life lingered beneath the snow. Families learned to follow these subtle signs, moving slowly so as not to disturb whatever fragile hope lay waiting. Wild garlic was among the most cherished discoveries. Though its leaves died back in early frost, its bulbs remained vibrant, holding their strength through the worst freezes. Foragers dug carefully at the edge of forest paths, loosening cold soil with wooden tools until the bulbs revealed themselves. Their sharp scent cut through the bitter air, promising warmth and clarity when added to broths that had grown weary and thin. Winter garlic was believed to guard families from illness, its flavour as welcome as its nourishment. Winter cress, with its hardy green leaves, pushed upward even as frost settled heavily over the earth. It brought a bright, peppery taste to meals that otherwise lacked colour or freshness. Families gathered it gently, grateful for the rare chance to eat something alive when most of the world seemed caught between sleep and stillness. Children often searched for it first, delighted by the defiant little patches of green that dared to grow where nothing else had. Nettles, preserved from the final days of autumn, offered another precious resource. Many households dried the leaves carefully, tying them in tight bundles and storing them near the hearth. When steeped in hot water, nettles created a revitalizing drink rich enough to steady a weary body. Some families believed nettle tea carried protective properties, guarding against the creeping weakness that winter sometimes brought. Others used the leaves in soups, where their earthy taste blended with roots and herbs to create something surprisingly comforting. Bitter roots played an equally important role. Buried deep beneath the frost, these roots held onto their strength throughout the winter. Families dug for them with quiet determination, clearing frozen soil to reach their hidden forms. Though some of these roots were tough and sharp in flavour, they could be boiled into something sustaining. Their bitterness hinted at hardship, yet their nourishment could not be denied. These roots were the backbone of many winter meals, grounding families with steady, reliable strength. The world felt different when one searched for plants in winter. The usual sounds of the forest grew muted, replaced by the soft crunch of snow and the distant groan of ice expanding beneath the cold. Foragers moved slowly, guided more by instinct than sight. They learned to sense where warmth lingered just long enough for certain plants to survive. A patch of disturbed snow, a slight rise in the ground, or the fragile outline of leaves trapped beneath ice could reveal where life waited. Much of this knowledge came through healers and midwives, the quiet guardians of herbal wisdom. These women understood the subtle language of plants, recognizing which roots strengthened the blood, which leaves soothed fever, and which bulbs revived a fading appetite. Their guidance carried an almost mystical weight, for their teachings blended observation with intuition, practicality with something that felt older than memory. They taught their apprentices through soft-spoken lessons, rarely writing anything down, knowing that wisdom preserved in memory was harder for winter to steal. To many in the village, winter foraging felt like conversing with a world that spoke only in whispers. Nature revealed its secrets slowly, rewarding those who listened. Families who mastered this quiet dialogue endured hunger better than those who depended on luck or hope alone. Each root and leaf reminded them that survival came not from force, but from understanding an intimate connection to the land that shaped and sustained them. These discoveries hinted that the frozen wilderness was far from empty. It was a living puzzle offering nourishment to those wise enough to search its silent depths with patience and care. And yet, plants were only one part of winter's hidden generosity. The world held stranger, quieter resources still waiting beneath the snow in unexpected places. Beneath the soft, deceptive quiet of winter snow, an unseen world continued to breathe. To most villagers, the frozen surface appeared barren, an endless white sheet that concealed nothing but hardened soil and the long sleep of the season. Yet those who understood the land's deeper rhythms knew better. They sensed the warmth trapped between earth and frost, the faint pulse of life that refused to surrender, and the secret foods hidden just inches below the surface. This hidden layer, an underworld, shaped by the slow pressure of snow, became a sanctuary of nourishment when the world above fell still. Foragers approached the snowy ground with the same attentiveness hunters used in the forest. They walked slowly, searching for subtle signs: a depression where the snow had sunk over a burrow, a small line of frost disturbed by a creature's passage, or a faint trail of steam rising from a hidden tunnel. These clues revealed pockets of life sheltered beneath the icy crust. Burrowing animals created warmth with their movements, and where heat met cold, a delicate mist formed visible only to those who knew how to look. Families followed these tiny signals as carefully as one might follow, smoke rising from a distant fire. Tree lichens, clinging stubbornly to bark beneath the snowline, were among the most dependable discoveries. These pale, crust-like growths were scraped carefully from tree trunks, using knives dulled to avoid damaging the bark. Though not pleasant when eaten raw, the lichens softened after a day of soaking, transforming into a chewy, mildly earthy food that filled the stomach and fortified the spirit. Some villages believed lichens carried protective properties, especially during winters known for illness. Whether this belief emerged from hope or experience hardly mattered. In harsh seasons, any sense of comfort became its own form of nourishment. Winter mushrooms were another hidden treasure. Unlike their autumn cousins, these mushrooms grew quietly in the cold, thriving in the thin space between earth and ice. After snowstorms, foragers searched for small, sunken patches where the weight of the mushrooms had caused the snow above them to collapse slightly. Digging there required patience and gentle hands. Winter mushrooms bruised easily, and a crushed cap meant a lost meal. Once gathered, they were dried beside the hearth or simmered into thick, fragrant broths that tasted far richer than the season should allow. Some families believed these mushrooms appeared only during winters touched by good fortune, as if the forest offered them as a quiet gesture of mercy. More elusive still were the subterranean fungi that surfaced only in the coldest months. These rare growths lived deep underground, emerging through cracks and root systems when the frost thickened above. Their shapes were strange, rounded bulbs or thin, veined ribbons that glowed faintly in lantern light. Villagers prized them not only for their flavor, but for the strength they provided during the darkest weeks. Preparing them was delicate work, long soaking to remove bitterness, careful slicing to detect rot, and slow cooking with herbs to coax out their rich, warming taste. Stories claimed these fungi had been used since ancient times, but few written records survived. Their mystery endured like the forest itself. Small burrowing animals also sustained many families. These creatures, voles, dormice, and other winter survivors, created networks of tunnels beneath the snow, protected from the wind and frost. To locate them, foragers pressed their palms against the snow, testing for subtle vibrations or pockets of warmth. When a tunnel was found, they dug quickly, mindful that the little animals could vanish in an instant. Though small, these creatures offered fat and meat that could be dried, roasted, or stewed. In some households, burrowing animals were considered delicacies reserved for times of celebration. In others, they were eaten only when starvation loomed, their consumption marked by silence and necessity. Waterlogged plants preserved by freeze-thaw cycles offered yet another unexpected meal. These roots and bulbs, softened by the shifting temperatures, could be unearthed near stream beds or beneath old tree roots. Their texture was unusual, spongy at first, then firming under heat. Families boiled them to remove bitterness, or sliced and dried them to store for future days. Though not among the most flavorful foods, they provided energy when little else remained. Their presence spoke of nature's quiet persistence, a life intertwined with cold rather than defeated by it. Finding these foods required more than observation. It required trust. Foragers had to believe that the snow concealed something worth the effort, that the world still held gifts hidden beneath its frost-covered shell. Some days yielded nothing, only cold fingers, numb feet, and the sting of disappointment. Other days offered treasures that felt almost miraculous. These discoveries reminded families that survival was not only a battle against winter's cruelty, but a relationship with the land itself. The earth whispered its secrets to those who listened, guiding their hands toward the nourishment they needed. Each of these hidden foods carried its own mythology. Some were blessed, some feared, and some regarded with quiet awe. But together, they formed a map of survival that passed through generations, a map etched in memory rather than ink. Yet even beneath the snow, nature's gifts did not end. Families looked not only downward but upward, sensing that winter's skies, too, held mysteries capable of sustaining life. When winter pressed hardest against medieval villages, families often looked downward into snowbanks, cellars, and frozen earth to find what little nourishment remained. Yet some of the most unusual gifts of the season came not from the ground, but from the sky and the cold breath of winter itself. These offerings were subtle, fleeting, and easily missed by those who hurried through their days. But to families who had learned to see winter not just as an adversary, but as a strange, unpredictable provider, the sky held its own quiet forms of sustenance. Fresh snow was more than a blanket of cold. When gathered in its earliest moments before footsteps, soot, or drifting winds disturbed it, it became a tool for preservation. Families packed this snow around clay jars or wrapped bundles of food, slowing the spoilage of precious ingredients. Even the simplest broth kept longer when cooled by layers of clean snow pressed tightly around the pot. Sometimes the snow was used to soften dried vegetables that had grown brittle over the long weeks of storage, bringing tenderness to roots that otherwise would have stayed tough in the pot. Snow was fragile, easily melted, yet its usefulness carried a strange elegance, a gift that vanished even as it preserved. The ice that formed on rooftops and along wooden beams held its own purpose. Families chipped away clear pieces, melting them slowly to create water free of the bitterness that seeped into well water during deep freezes. This soft, clean meltwater became the base for thin broths that stretched meagre supplies into something warm enough to comfort hungry bodies. It was remarkable how a pot of near nothing, a pinch of herbs, a spoonful of leftover fat, a scattering of dried leaves, could transform into something sustaining when mixed with water drawn from winter's frozen breath. In these small acts, families learned that the cold did not take everything. Sometimes it returned something delicate in exchange. But the most treasured gift from above was something far rarer, the phenomenon villagers called honey ice. During the coldest nights, when temperatures dropped so sharply that even the air seemed to crack, certain trees released tiny beads of sap that froze before they could fall. These beads clung to bark in glistening clusters, pale gold beneath the morning frost. Children often found them first, drawn by their faint sparkle. When warmed between fingers or placed on the tongue, honey ice softened into a sweet, resinous syrup that tasted like a memory of warmer seasons. Healers prized it as well, using it in mixtures believed to soothe sore throats and calm restless sleep. Families collected it sparingly, knowing its appearance depended on conditions as delicate as the sap itself. Snow also created peculiar formations that medieval texts occasionally referenced with reverence. A sugary frost known as winter manna. It was said to form on certain cold mornings when air, moisture, and sunlight aligned perfectly, leaving tiny crystalline flakes atop the snow. These flakes tasted faintly sweet, so faintly that many dismissed them as imagination. But chroniclers noted them with curiosity, describing them as heaven's crumbs scattered upon the earth. Families who found winter manna treated it as a blessing too rare to rely upon, yet too wondrous to forget. A small handful stirred into warm water created a lightly sweetened drink that lifted spirits on grim days. Even frost itself played a role in survival. When frost coated the outer walls of homes in shimmering layers, some families gently scraped it into bowls to melt into cool, clean water. Frost that formed on the inside of windows, thin, fragile, patterned like feathers, was collected even more carefully. Believed to be purer than ordinary ice, it was sometimes applied to fevers or mixed into herbal remedies. Though these practices may seem unusual today, they reflected a deep trust in the natural world, even at its coldest. Winter, in its own strange way, communicated with those who listened closely. Families watched the sky for more than snow. They watched for shifts in the clouds, the brightness of moonlit nights, the gleam of stars reflected on icy ground. These signs helped them predict when snow might fall fresh enough to collect, when lakes might freeze thick enough to walk upon, and when honey ice or winter manna might appear. Survival became a conversation between earth and sky, with humans listening carefully for whatever guidance nature offered. These gifts did not replace food. They did not fill bellies the way grains, roots, or meat did, but they softened hardship. They stretched supplies, revived spirits, and reminded families that winter held more complexity than its sharp winds suggested. The smallest offerings, a shard of tree sap, a bowl of melted frost, a handful of sweet crystals carried meaning far beyond their size. They were proof that even in the most unforgiving months, the world still held room for wonder. Yet the sky's gifts were only pieces of the larger puzzle of survival. Medieval families did more than forage or gather. They transformed, stretched, preserved, and reinvented their food with ingenuity that bordered on alchemy. And it is in this next chapter that the true art of making something from almost nothing begins to unfold. In the dim quiet of a medieval kitchen, where firelight flickered like a tired heartbeat and shadows gathered in the corners, cooks practiced a kind of alchemy that rarely appears in written histories. They worked not with abundance, but with remnant scraps others would dismiss, fragments that seemed too small or too humble to matter. Yet in the hands of someone who understood winter's demands, every piece of refuse became a possibility. Scarcity sharpened creativity, and the simplest scrap could become the difference between hunger and endurance. Bones, for example, were never thrown away. Once the meat had been stripped and the fat rendered, the bones were cracked open with stones or the back of an axe to release the rich marrow hidden inside. The marrow was precious, one of the few sources of deep warmth available during famine months. Afterward, the same bones were boiled again, and then again, until the water pulled every remaining trace of nourishment into a thin, milky broth. Even when the bones crumbled from overuse, they found new purpose. Ground into powder, they strengthened soups that otherwise tasted like little more than hot water. Nothing in the kitchen died a single death. Everything lived on through transformation. Vegetable peels received similar reverence. Onion skins, carrot tops, cabbage cores, parts often discarded today, were gathered and dried near the hearth, their edges curling in the warm air. Some families hung them from thin strands of twine until they became brittle enough to crush. The resulting flakes were mixed into coarse flour or added to stews to create bulk. The flavor was subtle, often earthy, but the nourishment they added was real. Even potato skins, when soaked and fried over a low flame, could offer a small burst of energy. To medieval cooks, peels were not refuse, but potential. Stale bread, too, found its second life through rituals that blurred the line between practicality and tradition. A hardened loaf could become the foundation of a soup when soaked long enough. Some households broke it into small pieces and simmered it slowly until it thickened into a hearty porridge. Others toasted the bread until it darkened and then pounded it into crumbs that enriched broths. A bowl of revived bread carried memories of better seasons, its scent rising like a forgotten comfort. Even the smallest crust was preserved carefully. In winter, bread never truly expired, it simply shifted shape. Ashes from clean fires played a surprising role in sustaining households. In small amounts, certain ashes were sifted through fine cloth to extract minerals believed to strengthen soups and aid digestion. Only ashes from particular woods were used, often those from fruit-bearing trees or slow-burning hardwoods. Cooks handled them with respect, as if the fire's memory still lingered. Added sparingly to pots, they transformed weak broths into something more substantial. Though the practice feels foreign now, it reflected a deep understanding of how every element of the home might serve survival. Even feathers, the lightest, most unlikely ingredient, found their place. When singed and cleaned, they were used to thicken stews, dissolving slowly over hours of gentle boiling. Their contribution was small, but in famine, small mattered. Some families believed that feathers offered not only sustenance but luck, as birds symbolized freedom from the earth's hardships. Whether this belief influenced the flavor, no one could say, but the gesture itself carried meaning, turning necessity into quiet ritual. Every scrap held a story. A piece of dried beetroot saved from harvest meant someone had thought ahead. A handful of seed husks represented hours of careful threshing. A thin rind of cheese, grated into a pot, told of a better season when milk flowed freely. These remnants linked families to their past and strengthened their resolve to reach the future. Cooks stitched these fragments together into meals that were never abundant but always meaningful. There was dignity in this work, though few spoke of it. Medieval cooks moved with a calm familiarity born from years spent coaxing flavor from scarcity. Their skill lay not only in technique but in patience. A pot might simmer for half a day before it revealed its potential. A broth might grow richer with each passing hour, transforming from clear water into a warm, sustaining meal. The quiet rhythm of stirring, tasting, adjusting it, all carried a heartbeat of hope in a season where hope grew thin. In these kitchens, the line between survival and creativity blurred. Families gathered around tables to eat meals that were humble in appearance, yet rich in meaning. Each bowl was a testament to resilience, to the understanding that life could be sustained through knowledge rather than abundance. Medieval cooks became artists of necessity, shaping meals that lifted spirits even when hunger lingered close by. Yet as days grew shorter and supplies grew thinner, scraps themselves became scarce. The bones had been boiled dry, the peels had been ground down, the ashes used sparingly until only a faint dusting remained. It was then that families turned not just to the ingredients they had, but to the methods that changed the very nature of food techniques that stretched, transformed, and reinvented what little remained. And in those methods, the art of survival reached an entirely different level. There was a quiet brilliance in the way medieval families stretched their dwindling food stores, a kind of instinctive science passed down through repetition rather than written rule. In kitchens warmed only by small, persistent flames, cooks learned how to coax abundance from scarcity, how to make a pot intended for one meal last for several, and how to transform thin broths into something hearty enough to quiet the gnawing ache of hunger. Their methods felt less like simple cooking and more like a gentle, persistent negotiation with the ingredients themselves, drawing out every hidden drop of sustenance winter had failed to claim. One of the most ingenious strategies involved thickening agents crafted from unlikely sources. Crushed seeds collected during warmer months, once too insignificant to matter, were ground into coarse powders and added to soups. As they cooked, they expanded, turning watery stews into filling meals. Powdered bark made from the inner layers of certain trees served a similar purpose. Though bitter, it absorbed liquid well and added body to dishes that would otherwise pass through the stomach too quickly. Families used only small amounts, balancing the bitterness with herbs when they could spare them. Even wild plants that swelled in water became valuable, their subtle changes transforming the texture of a meal. Boiled leather marked another boundary between desperation and ingenuity. Strips of old leather washed thoroughly and boiled repeatedly released a mild gelatin that added richness to broth. Though the flavor was faint, the substance it contributed mattered more. The leather softened slowly, dissolving enough to give the illusion of something more nourishing than it truly was. Families knew how far to push this technique and how long to boil the leather before it offered its final usefulness. Nothing in a medieval kitchen was wasted if it could offer even a whisper of strength. Fermentation played an equally vital role in stretching food beyond its natural limits. Families created broths that preserved themselves through careful souring. These broths grew stronger over time, deepening in flavor and developing a sour edge that made them resistant to spoilage. A pot of fermented stew might simmer gently for days, cooled at night and reheated at dawn. As the days passed, vegetables softened further, herbs released their final notes, and the liquid itself became dense with nutrients that would not have existed otherwise. These endlessly renewing soups became anchors in dark winters, their sourness a reminder that life could endure even when freshness was impossible. Among the most mysterious techniques was the practice known in some regions as the midwinter reboil. Each day, the same pot was reheated, even if only for a few minutes before being allowed to cool again. Families believed this ritual protected the stew from illness, preventing unseen dangers from settling within it. Whether through belief or science, the method worked. The regular heating cycles extended the life of the stew far longer than an untouched pot could ever last. Some families swore that each time the stew was reheated, its flavor grew deeper, richer, wiser somehow. Stories claim certain pots lasted for weeks, fed by additions of scraps, herbs, and bones that blended seamlessly into the evolving mixture. Layering ingredients also played a role in this quiet science. Cooks learned to place denser foods at the bottom of the pot, where heat lingered the longest, and add lighter ingredients slowly over time. This layering ensured that nothing cooked too quickly or lost its integrity before it could be used. By managing heat carefully, they coaxed hidden nutrients from roots and grains, unlocking strengths that remained dormant in faster cooking. Slow simmering became a way of respecting the food, a promise to extract everything it held before surrendering it to the hunger waiting at the table. Households also practiced timed heating and cooling cycles that mirrored ancient understandings of balance. Some families warmed a pot briefly in the morning, letting the warmth awaken the ingredients, then allowed it to rest until evening. This gentle approach reduced waste and kept meals from spoiling. It required patience and an almost tender attentiveness to the rhythms of the pot. Cooking became a conversation rather than a command, with the food responding to time just as much as temperature. What makes these methods feel like sorcery today is how seamlessly they blurred the boundaries between nourishment and ritual. A medieval cook understood that survival was not only about stretching ingredients but about transforming them. Each technique, crushing seeds, boiling leather, fermenting broth, reboiling stews, carried an echo of ancient knowledge. Even the simplest trick, like adding a handful of dried leaves at the right moment, could change a meal's future. These forgotten strategies reveal a world where food stretching was not a sign of weakness, but a display of remarkable resilience. It was a science shaped by constraint, creativity, and faith in the idea that even the smallest ingredient held hidden potential. Through these methods, families endured winters that would have otherwise swallowed them whole. But stretching food was only part of the story. The next and final step was something even more remarkable: transforming the inedible into the edible, reshaping the very nature of what a meal could be when survival depended on it. There were winters so merciless that medieval families found themselves staring at objects no one would willingly call food: strips of bark, brittle bones, leather hardened by age, roots twisted with bitterness, and weeds that seemed more suited for thatching roofs than filling bowls. Yet, in the coldest months, when hunger hollowed the cheeks of children and the silence of empty larders pressed heavily against the mind, these unlikely items became possibilities. Turning the inedible into the edible required not only courage, but a deep, patient knowledge of the land and its hidden rules. It was survival as quiet craftsmanship, sharpened by generations who had endured winters that tried to erase them. Some roots held nourishment that could not be accessed easily. They grew thick skins to guard against frost and bitterness that warned against careless consumption. But families who understood their secrets peeled them with slow, careful hands, then boiled them for hours, sometimes days, until the water leached out the harshness. The pot had to be watched closely, topped with fresh water whenever the bitterness rose to the surface like foam. Only when the root surrendered its toughness did it become something that could be swallowed. Even then, its flavor carried a faint memory of struggle. To eat it was to acknowledge that winter had pushed beyond comfort and into necessity. Bark, too, transformed under patient hands. The inner layers from certain trees stripped in thin sheets were pounded, dried, and ground into coarse shavings. These were boiled repeatedly, changing the water each time until the final mixture softened into a paste that thickened soups. The texture was grainy, the taste surprisingly mild, but the nourishment it offered could stretch a meal far beyond what the original ingredients allowed. Families treated bark with a reverence that bordered on ritual, knowing that choosing the wrong tree could bring illness instead of relief. It was knowledge no one took lightly. Tough weeds that grew in forgotten corners of fields or clung stubbornly to the outskirts of villages held their own hidden value. In summer they were ignored, in winter they became treasured finds. The trick lay in fermenting them long enough to break down their fibers. Bundles of weeds were submerged in clay pots filled with water, weighted with stones, and left near the hearth where gentle warmth encouraged transformation. Weeks later, the softened weeds were rinsed thoroughly, boiled, and added to stews. What emerged was not delicious, but undeniably edible proof that even the most unassuming plant could surrender its strength if treated with patience and care. Old leather provided another strange form of sustenance. Shoes long worn, scraps left from harnesses, and straps kept in storage for years could be softened into something resembling food. It began with soaking, sometimes for days, until the leather lost its stiffness. Then came the boiling, a slow, steady process that coaxed calories from the hide into the water. The resulting broth was thin but warming, and the softened leather could be chewed long enough to extract what little remained within it. Families rarely spoke of these meals. They carried a quiet shame, yet they also represented resilience. To consume leather was to refuse surrender. Bones, even after being boiled beyond their flavor, still held value. Once dried, they could be crushed into fine powder, using stones heated by fire. This powder, chalky, pale, and faintly metallic, was mixed into porridges to add minerals and faint traces of energy. The process required strength and precision. A careless strike could send fragments scattering across the floor, yet the powder was treasured. In the depths of winter, even the ghost of nourishment mattered. Some ingredients hovered dangerously close to poison, demanding absolute care. One mistake, one bitter root left unboiled too long, one fungus misidentified could bring sickness that the cold would quickly worsen. Stories passed through generations spoke of families who attempted these transformations too hastily, paying dearly for the error. These cautionary tales were whispered not to frighten but to teach. Survival depended on precision. Yet for every frightening story, there were others filled with quiet triumph. Families who prepared these ingredients correctly felt a fierce sense of victory, as though they had outwitted the season itself. A pot of softened weeds, a broth made from bark, a small bowl of root mashed their presence at the table, offered hope in tangible form. Hunger eased slightly, spirits lifted. The world, though still frozen, felt a fraction less cruel. Turning the inedible into the edible was more than technique. It was a testament to human resolve, to the belief that life could continue even when winter tried to say otherwise. The transformation required patience, trust in inherited wisdom, and the ability to see possibility where others saw only despair. Each method carried the fingerprints of countless generations who had learned through trial, error, and endurance. But while these extraordinary foods kept bodies alive, they could not shield the mind from the weight of famine. As winter stretched relentlessly onward, survival demanded more than ingenuity in the kitchen. It required emotional strength, communal bonds, and the quiet courage to face each day. And so the story shifts from the craft of stretching food to the deeper landscapes of hunger, where the struggle moved beyond the pot and into the heart of every household. Hunger did not arrive like a sudden storm. It slipped quietly into medieval homes, settling first in the corners, then beneath the beds, then along the rafters where smoke gathered. Before anyone spoke of it aloud, it was already present, a quiet, watchful companion that softened footsteps and lowered voices. At first, families tried to ignore it, pretending that the dwindling meals were only temporary. Yet every day the portions grew smaller, and every night the conversations grew shorter, until even the youngest children sensed the shift in the air. The home no longer echoed with idle chatter. It breathed with caution. The hearth became the center of everything. Its small, crackling flame offered the only sense of warmth and constancy left in the household. Families huddled close, not merely for heat, but for reassurance, as though the fire itself stood guard against the cold and the emptiness creeping inward. Parents stirred thin broths in silence, stretching them little by little while pretending the flavor remained unchanged. Children watched the steam rise, hopeful that it signaled abundance rather than scarcity. Each sip tasted of comfort and fear at once. Hunger changed how people moved. Adults walked more slowly, conserving energy without intending to. They lingered near the hearth longer, reluctant to step into the colder parts of the home. Simple tasks grew heavier. Lifting a pot required a deep breath. Climbing the stairs demanded a moment to rest. Even laughter altered. It emerged more rarely, softer, as though people feared wasting the breath it required. Hunger made every motion deliberate, shaped by the understanding that each calorie saved today might be needed tomorrow. It changed speech too. Conversations once casual and warm became careful, calculated. Parents spoke in gentle tones, their words chosen to keep children calm. They avoided mentioning empty shelves or hunts gone wrong. Instead, they encouraged little victories, finding a handful of nuts at the forest edge, discovering a forgotten root in a storage pit, or catching sight of a deer trail promising hope. These small successes became stories retold at night, each one carrying more meaning than its simplicity suggested. Parents often sacrificed quietly. They would push away half-full bowls with a smile, claiming they weren't hungry, that the broth was too warm, that their stomach ached. Children believed them at first. Later, they watched more closely, noticing how their parents' cheeks thinned and their movements slowed. The unspoken rule of winter scarcity emerged. Children ate first. The elders took only what they needed, and the parents standing between generations gave up the most. Elders, with memories built from winters long past, offered guidance shaped by survival. They told stories of blizzards that buried entire homes, of rivers that froze so deeply they silenced the world, of years when even the animals vanished. Yet within these stories lived wisdom: how to store warmth by hanging blankets over door frames, how to curb thirst by sucking on snow instead of drinking precious water, how to share breath beneath blankets on the coldest nights. Their stories, though heavy, were lanterns in the dark, reminding the household that others had endured even harsher seasons. Animals felt hunger's presence too. Dogs stopped barking as frequently. Cats curled nearer to the hearth, their movements lethargic. Livestock grew restless, pacing within their pens as if sensing the desperation growing inside the home. Even the birds that sometimes perched on roof beams changed their patterns, calling less often, observing more carefully. Hunger carried a vibration that reached every living thing. Despite the growing weight of fear, hope continued to flicker. Hope in the form of a root scraped from frozen soil, a pot of broth that somehow fed everyone one more night, or a small bundle of dried herbs found tucked behind a sack of grain. These small moments carried the household forward. They were reminders that survival hinged not on abundance but on persistence, on choosing to endure together rather than collapsing alone. Hunger reshaped relationships in quiet, poignant ways. Some families grew closer, bound tightly by the shared battle against the cold. Parents held children longer at night, whispering soothing promises, even when they doubted them. Couples shared silent glances across the room, communicating resolve without speaking. Other relationships frayed beneath the strained quick tempers, small arguments, the bitterness of sacrifice unacknowledged. Scarcity tested the emotional fabric of the home, revealing its strengths and exposing its fragile seams. The nights were hardest, when darkness stretched across the sky and the hearth's glow dimmed. Hunger's presence grew more palpable. Stomachs ached. Thoughts drifted toward food that wasn't there. Sleep came in shallow waves, interrupted by cold drafts or restless minds replaying the day's failures. Yet even in these long nights, families found ways to hold on to one another, sharing blankets, telling stories, or reciting prayers that felt older than the walls around them. In these moments, hunger became more than a physical sensation. It became a companion that shaped the rhythm of the home. It watched every decision, lingered in every silence, and dictated the pace of each day. And though families fought against it, they learned to live beside it, adapting their hopes and habits to its presence. But hunger did not confine itself to individual households. Its shadow stretched outward, touching neighbors, friends, and rivals alike. The pressures that reshaped families soon began reshaping entire communities, altering the way villages interacted, cooperated, and survived together. And that widening emotional landscape belongs to the next chapter of this winter story. Winter scarcity reshaped medieval villages in ways that were both quiet and profound. As food stores thinned, the rhythm of community life changed, and the distance between homes felt both painfully close and strangely vast. People listened more carefully to footsteps along the lanes, wondering whether the sound meant help or competition. No one intended harm, yet hunger sharpened awareness until every glance carried meaning. Villagers sensed that survival depended not only on what each family possessed, but on the delicate web tying every household together. Trust became fragile during these months, bending under weight too subtle for outsiders to understand. Neighbors who once shared laughter at harvest festivals now exchanged quiet, searching looks across fences. A small gesture, an open door, a lingering pause, a glance toward a shed could spark suspicion. Yet beneath the tension lay genuine concern. No one wanted to see another family fall into despair. They simply feared lacking enough to help. Hunger created this complex ache, blending caution with compassion in ways that challenged every heart. Bartering grew tense as scarcity deepened. A jar of dried herbs could outweigh a whole basket of turnips, and families guarded their supplies with quiet desperation. Transactions, once conducted in the open, shifted into corners of barns or dim spaces behind homes. Even honest trades carried an edge, because every exchange represented a gamble with the future. Yet bartering also held sparks of hope. When a trade succeeded, both sides felt briefly strengthened, as if the village itself had exhaled and regained a little balance. Despite tension, winter also forged unexpected alliances. Families pooled scraps not because they had extra, but because solidarity softened fear. A neighbor might bring a small bundle of dried nettles. Another might share a handful of preserved berries found in a forgotten pouch. These offerings were never extravagant, but their meaning ran deep. Sharing even a little required courage, for it meant admitting weakness while showing generosity. Such exchanges built fragile bridges, thin threads, that held the community together when everything else strained. Villagers sometimes gathered around a communal pot kept simmering at the center of the settlement. The broth inside was thin, often little more than warm water touched with herbs, yet it symbolized unity. People contributed whatever they could spare, a sliver of root, a pinch of dried greens, a scrap of meat saved for emergencies. As the pot bubbled, the mixture became a testament to shared endurance. Standing around it, villagers felt momentarily protected from the loneliness of hunger, held by the warmth of collective hope. Even rituals shifted to reflect the pressure of the season. At dusk, villagers murmured brief prayers not for abundance, but for just enough strength to greet another morning. Lanterns glowed in windows to signal quiet pleas for assistance, gestures that allowed neighbors to respond without forcing anyone to admit need aloud. Some families placed small tokens outside their doors, offerings meant to encourage goodwill or ward off despair. These customs grew naturally from hardship, weaving threads of meaning through nights that felt darker with every passing week. Suspicion, however, lingered at the edges of cooperation. Families watched one another carefully, counting how often smoke rose from a chimney or how many footsteps crossed a snowy path. Not every observation held malice. Often it was fear disguised as vigilance. People worried that a neighbor might possess more than they admitted, or worse, that someone might be nearing collapse in silent suffering. This dual awareness created an atmosphere where kindness and anxiety lived side by side, shaping conversations into gentle negotiations rather than open exchanges. Through all of this, elders acted as anchors for village life. Their memories stretched across decades of winters, some harsher than the present, and they shared their knowledge with soft authority. They reminded families how to portion dwindling stores, how to interpret changing skies, and how to recognize the difference between despair and simple fatigue. Elders became living repositories of survival, carrying stories that warned, guided, and soothed. Their presence steadied the community, offering a reassurance rooted not in certainty, but in experience. Community gatherings grew rarer but more meaningful. When villagers braved the cold to meet, they spoke in low voices, exchanging updates on hunts, harvest remnants, or signs of approaching storms. These meetings bound them together, reminding everyone that even in scarcity they were not alone. Sometimes a shared worry would spark collective resolve. Other times, a hopeful rumor about a passing merchant or a mild week ahead lifted spirits. Each gathering became a small lantern against the encroaching dark, bright enough to guide but never to illuminate fully. Fear and hope intertwined through each day, shaping a community balancing at the edge of need. The villagers understood that their survival rose and fell together. Hunger tested bonds, revealing both the tenderness and the tension woven into shared life. Yet beneath every anxious glance and quiet offering lived something ancient, the belief that winter's grip could be endured if hearts stayed connected. And as these emotional currents deepened, a spiritual response awakened beneath them, shaping the path toward what still quietly waited just beyond sight. When winter carved deeper into the land and hunger pressed too closely against the walls of every home, medieval families turned inward not only to their hearths, but to their beliefs. Scarcity reshaped the emotional landscape, but it also stirred something older and quieter, a spiritual awareness that seemed to rise from the cold earth itself. Hunger was never just a physical ache. It was a question, a mystery, an unsettling reminder that life hung by threads too thin to see. Families sought answers wherever they could find them in memory, in ritual, and in the ancient practices that lingered long after their origins had been forgotten. During ordinary seasons, prayers flowed easily. People gave thanks for harvests, for safe hunts, for mild storms, but in famine winters, gratitude softened into quiet pleas. Families gathered close near the hearth, heads bowed not in ceremony, but in shared vulnerability. Their whispered words carried a different tone, not requests for abundance, but for endurance. They asked for warmth in their bones, for calm dreams for their children, for strength to survive another day. These murmured prayers filled the dim rooms, wrapping themselves around the rising smoke like fragile threads of hope. Above the doorways of many homes hung small symbols believed to protect against misfortune. Some were carved from bone, others woven from dried grasses or strips of fabric saved from better times. Though simple in appearance, these talismans carried emotional weight. Families touched them each time they crossed the threshold, as though transferring a portion of their fear into the object. Visitors noticed them, but rarely spoke of them. Such protections were too personal, too sacred, to discuss openly. In the depth of winter, these symbols became anchors, small assurances that unseen forces still watched over the household. Food itself took on spiritual meaning during famine. A scrap of dried fruit shared between siblings felt like a blessing. A root found beneath frozen soil seemed like an offering from the earth. Even the thinnest broth, when consumed during the coldest nights, carried a sense of ritual. Elders sometimes said the food tasted different in winter because hunger made the spirit sharper. Whether this was true or merely a comforting belief, families leaned into it, finding solace in the idea that their meals, however meager, held purpose beyond sustenance. Night rituals became especially important. Before eating, some families whispered blessings over the pot, tracing small symbols in the air above the steam. Others placed charms near the hearthstone, tiny carvings or stones believed to invite warmth or ward away sickness. A few families followed the old tradition of leaving offerings at the edge of the forest, a spoonful of broth, a piece of bread, sometimes even a single berry. These offerings were meant to keep the spirits calm, a phrase repeated in hushed tones. Whether the spirits referred to ancestors, forest beings, or forces of nature, no one fully explained. The meaning had shifted over centuries, but the act endured. In the darkest winters, people looked for signs everywhere. A particularly bright sunrise could hint at mercy. A sudden gust of warm air might feel like a whispered reassurance. Even the sound of wind moving differently around the house could be interpreted as a message. Children watched their parents for cues, sensing the unspoken belief that the world held layers of meaning beyond what the eyes could see. These interpretations were not born from superstition alone. They were born from a need for order in a world that often felt unpredictable. Many of these winter practices carried echoes of older traditions, beliefs that existed long before the medieval period and survived only because they felt essential during hardship. Elders told stories of ancestors who called upon the spirits of rivers, forests, and mountains to protect them from famine. Though the details of these tales had faded, their emotional truth remained. The rituals practiced in medieval homes were threads woven from countless generations of endurance. Families felt this lineage even if they did not understand it, sensing that their survival connected them to a story much larger than their own. Some foods were considered spiritually potent when eaten during the harshest months. Certain bitter roots were thought to strengthen not just the body, but the will. Honeyed mixtures, made from rare stores of summer harvest, were given to the very young or the very old, believed to preserve their spirits during moments of weakness. A few families even saved a single special ingredient for the longest night of winter, a symbolic meal shared in silence, honoring both those who had survived past winters and those who had not. In this emotional and spiritual landscape, hunger became a teacher. It revealed weaknesses but also uncovered strengths no one knew they possessed. Families learned to navigate the thin line between despair and hope, finding meaning in rituals that soothed hearts even when stomachs remained empty. These practices offered something food could not: structure, purpose, and a sense of connection to forces beyond the reach of winter's cold. By the time the harshest part of the season arrived, medieval families understood that survival depended on more than the meager meals they crafted. Emotional endurance mattered, community solidarity mattered, and the quiet faith that carried them through long nights mattered just as deeply. Yet spiritual strength alone could not fill empty stomachs or preserve dwindling supplies. Families needed practical wisdom as well, knowledge of how to store, protect, and stretch their food for as long as winter demanded. And so the story moves forward into the domain of preservation, where ingenuity became as vital as belief. Long before the first frost kissed the fields, medieval families began a quiet, methodical dance of preparation, a ritual older than memory and refined by centuries of necessity. Preservation was not simply a task to be completed before winter. It was a sacred rhythm that guided the final weeks of autumn. As the days shortened and the air thinned with cold, homes filled with the deep scents of smoke, salt, and earth. From these humble materials, families crafted time itself, capturing the warmth of summer and locking it safely away for the long, unforgiving months ahead. In many households, the heart of this process lay in the smoke-filled kitchen. Thick beams overhead supported hooks and wooden rods, where cuts of meat hung like silent guardians of the coming season. The smoke curled around them slowly, layer by layer, infusing each piece with a flavor that deepened as days passed. Children watched the process with wide eyes, noticing how the color of the meat shifted from raw crimson to the rich, dark tones of preservation. Smoke did more than season it protected, sealing the flesh against rot and winter's creeping damp. Some families added herbs to the fire, believing their fragrance strengthened the meat's ability to endure. Salt huts stood at the edges of villages, their thick walls built to withstand both wind and time. Large stones, heated during the waning warmth of late autumn, released dry air long after the fires died. Families brought vegetables, herbs, strips of fish, and even fruits to these huts, laying them on woven mats or hanging them from rafters. The air inside felt dry enough to crack the lips, yet the promise it carried made the discomfort worthwhile. Here, food was transformed by absence of moisture, absence of decay, absence of haste. Dehydration was both science and ritual, guided by instinct and inherited memory. Immersing food in animal fat was another method treasured for its reliability. Cooked meats were packed tightly into clay pots, then covered with layers of molten fat that cooled into a firm, pale seal. This fat barrier kept air from reaching the food, acting as a silent sentinel against spoilage. Families preserved roasts, game birds, and even small fish this way, stacking the pots in dark corners of their larders. When opened weeks or months later, the pot exhaled the scent of warmth captured in a single moment of preparation. Some households believed the fat itself held protective qualities, carrying the life of the animal into the winter. Equally revered were the earth mounds where sealed jars were buried to keep them cool and stable. These mounds, simple rises of soil or grass-covered pits, held temperatures that shifted little, no matter how fiercely winter winds blew. Within them, jars wrapped in cloth waited patiently, guarded by the steady breath of the earth. Roots, berries, syrups, and broths rested there beside jars of fermented grains, all sleeping beneath the soil like seeds awaiting spring. Digging into these mounds in midwinter carried a quiet thrill, as though retrieving something entrusted to the land itself for safekeeping. Stepping into a larder in deep winter felt like entering a world suspended between life and silence. The air stood still, cool without being harsh, and shadows clung to every corner. Shelves lined the walls, each one supporting the weight of jars wrapped carefully in cloth that protected them from light, pests, and curious eyes. Bundles of dried greens hung from ceiling beams, their shapes fragile and ghost-like in the dim light. Clay pots sealed with wax waited on the lowest shelves, their contents as mysterious as their purpose was essential. No one lingered here without reverence. A larder was more than storage. It was the heart of hope for the season ahead. Every preservation method carried with it the stories of those who had refined it. Families practiced these techniques with the precision of ritual, aware that the smallest misstep could lead to ruin. Too little smoke, and a cut of meat might sour. Too much heat in the salt huts, and herbs turned brittle beyond use. Incorrect sealing of a jar could invite mold that spread like a whisper of despair. These were not tasks to be hurried. They required patience, consistency, and a calm mind qualities, shaped by winters that punished carelessness and rewarded attentiveness. Some practices blurred the line between practicality and symbolism. Before sealing certain jars, some families whispered blessings over the contents, thanking the earth for its gifts and asking for strength in the months ahead. Others carved small protective marks into the lids of pots or placed sprigs of dried rosemary above the doorway as a charm against spoilage. Whether these gestures held tangible effect hardly mattered. They grounded the process in meaning, turning preservation into a quiet defiance of the cold. By the time winter settled fully across the land, every family relied on these methods. They were the result of countless trials, failures, and triumphs knowledge, shaped by desperation, and handed down with near religious care. Preservation was preparation, yes, but it was also a ritual against the unknown, a way to hold on to life when the world beyond the walls faded into frost and silence. Yet not all foods fit neatly onto larder shelves or hung from kitchen rafters. Some ingredients possessed qualities so rare or powerful that only a few families knew how to preserve them. These secret methods, guarded as fiercely as treasure, belonged to the next chapter of winter's hidden knowledge. Among the jars and bundles that filled medieval larders, there existed a smaller, more mysterious collection. Foods so rare, so potent, or so difficult to prepare that they required extraordinary protection. These were not the common stores of grain and dried herbs, nor the everyday pots of smoked meat or preserved vegetables. These were the treasures of winter, guarded with the same seriousness one might reserve for heirlooms or sacred relics. A single jar could mean safety for a week. A single root could determine the fate of an ailing child. And because their power was undeniable, these foods slipped quietly into the realm of legend. Rare medicinal roots were among the most carefully guarded. Pulled from deep soil just before the first frost, these roots stored a kind of concentrated life that made them invaluable during the darkest months. Some were known to revive strength in the weak, soothing fevers, or calming unsettled stomachs. Others carried a bitterness that, when properly prepared, brought warmth to the body and clarity to the mind. Their storage demanded precision. Wrapped in cloth, sealed in clay, and kept in darkness so complete that even the smallest beam of light was believed to weaken their potency. Families passed down not just the roots, but the knowledge of how to preserve them, whispering warnings to never let the sleeping medicines be disturbed before they were truly needed. Equally precious were the strange cheeses crafted in the final weeks of autumn. These were not the familiar wheels stored in cool rooms, but dense, pungent forms aged with herbs, ash, or specific molds known only to certain families. Their preparation required exact temperatures and controlled humidity conditions, maintained through elaborate rituals involving stone-lined chambers, slow-turning wooden shelves, and careful observation. The result was a cheese so rich in fat and nutrients that a single slice could sustain someone through an entire day of labor. Because these cheeses carried so much value, families wrapped them in waxed cloth and hid them in the darkest corners of their secret cellars, speaking of them only in private. Then there were the intensely preserved fish pastes, dark, potent mixtures that aged for weeks or months until they reached a level of strength almost unimaginable to modern tastes. Made from ground fish, salt, fermented grains, and sometimes dried herbs, these pastes were stored in small clay jars sealed with wax. Their aroma was overwhelming to the unaccustomed, but a spoonful stirred into a pot could transform a thin broth into something unexpectedly nourishing. Certain coastal families guarded their recipes fiercely, passing them from parent to child as if they were spells rather than instructions. A jar of fish paste could be traded for tools, firewood, or protection, making it both a food and a currency. High-calorie fats, rendered from animals slaughtered before winter's deepest cold, represented yet another sacred reserve. These fats, when sealed properly beneath layers of wax or cooled in stone containers, could last for months without spoiling. They were often mixed with dried berries, crushed seeds, or slivers of dried meat to create dense, portable blocks used by hunters or travelers. Families stored these fat mixtures in places where temperature never wavered under heavy floorboards, behind thick stone walls, or in mounds of packed earth. Losing even one block meant losing countless calories, and with them, a measure of security. Some rare foods required constant supervision. Fermented mixtures needed stirring every few days to prevent the formation of harmful molds. Jars containing layered grains and herbs had to be turned gently to maintain balance within. These tasks often fell to a single person in the household, someone entrusted with the subtle rhythm of preservation. Their role carried immense responsibility. If they forgot a stirring or delayed a turning, the entire reserve could collapse into spoilage. In families that survived winter after winter, this caretaker role was respected as deeply as that of the hunters or the healers. Because these foods were so important, they carried stories and taboos that shaped their place in the household. Some families believed the jars should never be opened during storms, fearing that the violent winds could taint the spirit of the food. Others insisted that certain roots should only be used at dawn, when the light was gentle and the house was quiet. These beliefs created a sense of ritual around preservation, as though the foods themselves held a magic that demanded reverence. Every household guarded these rare stores with vigilance. Visitors were seldom shown the rooms where they rested. Sometimes even children did not know the full extent of what their family possessed. The knowledge was parceled out slowly, inherited like a secret burden. When hunger loomed, families approached these foods with both gratitude and caution, knowing that using them too soon could leave them vulnerable later. These precious reserves remind us that winter survival was not only about storing food, it was about protecting possibility itself, but even the rarest ingredients could not last indefinitely. Families needed techniques to stretch the lifespan of these treasures far beyond what seemed possible. And it is there, in the art of preservation's final frontier, that the next section begins. Some foods were crafted not merely to survive winter, but to outlast it, foods so enduring, so stubbornly resistant to decay, that they took on a life of their own in medieval memory. These were the long winter foods, the quiet sentinels hidden in cellars and larders, waiting patiently through storms, darkness, and frost. Their existence blurred the boundary between sustenance and legend, reminding families that even in a world ruled by cold, human ingenuity, could carve out pockets of time that resisted the season's relentless hunger. One of the most enduring traditions was the eternal stew, a pot kept on the hearth through the entire winter. It was never emptied, only replenished scraps, bones, herbs, and whatever small treasure a family gathered were added slowly, merging with what had simmered the day before. Over time, the stew deepened in flavour, taking on a character shaped by countless additions. Travellers spoke of these pots with awe, claiming the oldest stews tasted of memory itself, each sip carrying whispers of past meals. Families treated the pot like a guardian of the home, stirring it with reverence, as though its longevity offered a shield against the cold. Blocks of dried meat represented another marvel of endurance. These slabs were hardened through a careful combination of drying, smoking, and salt curing until they reached a density that defied time. Their surfaces grew tough as stone, requiring hours, sometimes days of boiling to soften. But once revived, the meat returned essential strength to bones that had grown weak during winter. Villagers admired these blocks not for their taste, but for their unwavering reliability. They were anchors in a season full of shifting uncertainties. Then there were the grains sealed in clay jars, ancient preservation at its most brilliant. Mixed with ash or wrapped in leaves, these grains were placed inside vessels fired over steady heat, forming a protective barrier that moisture could not breach. Some jars were passed from one generation to the next, their contents still edible decades later. Chroniclers occasionally mentioned such stores with reverence, describing them as treasures untouched by time. Families who possessed these jars treated them with ceremonial care, opening them only during the harshest winters or when illness threatened to claim one of their own. Long-lasting fish bricks carried a similar sense of awe. Crafted from fish pressed tightly together and dried into compact forms, these bricks were stacked in larders like building stones, each one capable of producing several meals when boiled. Villagers relied on them during storms, when lakes froze too deeply to fish, or when hunts failed repeatedly. Their smell was sharp, their texture unyielding, but their endurance provided comfort, a promise that hunger could be held at bay just a little longer. Fermented root stores offered another lifeline. Certain roots, when buried in earthen pits or sealed in wooden barrels, transformed slowly during winter, gaining depth and nourishment. These roots, once too bitter or tough to eat raw, softened over months until they could be sliced into stews or eaten plain. Their transformation felt almost magical, as though winter itself had changed them into something greater than what the harvest had provided. Families spoke of these root stores with quiet pride, knowing they required forethought, technique, and patience. Animal fats preserved in layers stood among the most dependable winter foods. Rendered carefully and poured into clay containers, these fats formed striated blocks that resembled candle wax. Each layer marked a different moment of preparation: fat from late autumn hunts, fat from early winter livestock, fat preserved after festive meals. When cut into pieces and melted into stews, these layers released warmth and energy that could bolster even the weakest member of the household. Their longevity made them sacred, their loss unthinkable. Berry pastes, hardened into resilient slabs, carried sweetness into seasons where sweetness no longer existed. Mixed with honey, or dried slowly in the waning sunlight of autumn, these slabs resisted mold and decay. Children treasured them when the cold grew harsh, savouring each small bite like a secret held close to the heart. Travellers sometimes traded for these pastes, valuing their portability and the bright burst of flavour they offered amid winter's monotony. Each of these long winter foods represented mastery over time itself. They were more than meals, they were guardians. Their presence in a home meant safety, resilience, and connection to ancestors who had refined these techniques through countless difficult seasons. Villagers spoke of them with a mixture of practicality and awe, acknowledging that these foods had carried families through tragedies, storms, scarcity, and uncertainty. Yet even these marvels had limits. No matter how long they lasted, no matter how carefully they were protected, winter demanded more than endurance. Families had to plan, adapt, and reshape their habits each year. And as the season waned, these long-lasting foods became reminders of the choices that had sustained them and the lessons that would guide the winters still to come. Thus, as preservation meets its final boundary, the story shifts toward reflection. What these practices meant, how they shaped medieval identity, and what legacy they left behind for the generations that followed. Harsh winters carved lessons into medieval life in ways no book, teacher, or decree ever could. These lessons were not taught in a single moment, nor spoken outright. They lived quietly in the rhythm of each season, carried from one generation to the next like an inheritance woven from experience, sacrifice, and memory. As snow fell year after year, families learned to read the world with a kind of reverent attention, watching the sky, noting the way the wind shifted, listening to the subtle changes in the forest's voice. Winter demanded awareness. It rewarded patience. It taught caution, resilience, and the ability to find meaning in the smallest signs of hope. When the first frost crept across the ground, medieval families felt a familiar tightening in their hearts, an acknowledgement of the months ahead. But along with that quiet fear came traditions that helped them navigate what could not be avoided. Elders lit small candles near the hearth to mark the turning of the season, a gesture meant to invite warmth into the home. Children gathered around fires to hear stories of winters long survived, told in voices soft as falling snow. These stories were not meant to frighten but to anchor the young, reminding them that hardship was not new and that their ancestors had endured far worse. Patience became one of the most deeply rooted virtues. Families understood that winter could not be rushed or outwitted. It had to be lived through, one careful day at a time, meals stretched, tasks slowed. Hope was measured not in abundance, but in persistence. Parents taught their children how to mend clothing rather than replace it, how to portion foods so no single meal left the household vulnerable, how to rest without surrendering, and how to remain steady in the face of scarcity. These lessons were not framed as philosophy, they were survival. Yet over time, they shaped an entire way of thinking, a respect for endurance, a belief in steady effort, and a quiet acceptance of limits. Caution also became a guiding principle. Winters could shift with barely a warning, and families learned to prepare for what they could neither predict nor prevent. They stored more than they expected to need, mended tools before they broke, and listened carefully to the forest animals, whose behavior often revealed more than human observation could. A sudden silence in the woods, a deer trail disappearing overnight, or frost forming thicker than usual on windows, all these became signals of change. Medieval life, shaped by winter, taught people to respond with care rather than panic. Alongside caution lived gratitude, a deep, almost spiritual appreciation for the simplest things. A warm drink after a freezing morning felt like a blessing. The discovery of a root in the frozen soil could lift spirits for days. A successful hunt brought not only meat, but a renewed sense of possibility. Even the faintest glimmer of sunlight through heavy clouds carried meaning. Winter minimized the world, stripping away excess and revealing which comforts mattered most. Warmth, companionship, shared food, and stories softly spoken before sleep. These emotional lessons formed the foundation of medieval identity. People became observers of nature's moods, stewards of their environment, and keepers of memory. Winters taught them that survival relied not solely on strength, but on unity within households and across communities. A single family could not endure every trial alone. Knowledge and cooperation became as valuable as stored grain. Elders taught their children which plants hid beneath snow, which winds signaled storms, and which rituals eased the spirit during long, hungry nights. These teachings shaped not only winter habits, but the very culture of the people who practiced them. Winter rituals became an essential part of this cultural inheritance. At the first frost, some families sang old songs believed to steady the heart against fear. Others placed sprigs of preserved herbs above their doors, to honor ancestors who had survived past winters. In certain regions, families gathered around the hearth on the longest night of the year to recite stories of those who had endured the cold with dignity. These rituals preserved more than tradition, they preserved courage. They offered structure during a season that tested both body and spirit. And so, through centuries of frozen nights and cautious mornings, winter shaped medieval life into something rich with meaning. The people who lived in its shadow were not simplistic or primitive, as later generations sometimes imagined. They were skilled observers, adapting their methods to the land's demands with a blend of practicality and reverence. They were careful problem solvers who understood the balance between preparation and humility. They were guardians of knowledge earned through suffering, and they carried that knowledge forward with the hope that their descendants would never face winter unprepared. In this quiet, reflective landscape, winter becomes more than a season. It becomes a teacher, a stern but honest one. It carved wisdom into those who listened, shaping their values, their traditions, and their understanding of the world. This wisdom did not remain confined to individual homes. Over time, it shaped entire communities, cultures, and regions. And that larger transformation, the way winter scarcity influenced collective identity, unfolds in the next section, where the story widens beyond the family hearth and into the fabric of medieval society itself. Winter did more than test medieval families. It shaped the very culture they passed down. Even after the snow melted and the first green shoots pierced the thawing earth, the memory of hunger lingered like a shadow woven into daily life. Scarcity, repeated year after year, carved itself into the traditions, rituals, and stories of entire regions. It became part of how communities understood the world, themselves, and the invisible forces they believed governed the seasons. To live through winter was to earn knowledge. To remember winter was to ensure survival for those yet to come. Festivals emerged from these memories. The return of sunlight, marked by lengthening days, and the first visible shift in the horizon's glow became a reason for celebration, not because people loved the warmth, but because they had survived the cold. Feasts marking the first harvest were steeped in reverence. Each loaf of bread carried symbolic meaning, not merely food, but proof that the world had softened again. Villagers sang songs that honored the end of hardship. Some of these songs spoke plainly of past hunger. Others cloaked their themes in metaphors of darkness giving way to dawn. Children learned them early, not fully understanding the weight embedded in the melodies, but inheriting the emotional truth all the same. Community ceremonies reinforced this sense of shared endurance. On certain nights before deep winter set in, families gathered in the village square to light communal fires. They shared small bowls of broth, the same meal in each home, as a symbol of unity. These rituals reminded everyone that although winter pressed individually upon each household, it also belonged to the village as a whole. In some regions, people walked the perimeter of their homes carrying candles or lanterns, sealing the warmth inside with gentle motions and murmured blessings. Others hung specific herbs above their doorframes, believed to trap the memory of summer sunlight and protect their homes from the cold. Superstitions grew from the lessons hunger taught. Wasting even a crumb was considered foolish at best, disrespectful at worst. Children were told that throwing away bread invited bad luck or harsh weather. Spilling grain prompted quiet apologies to the earth. Even the smallest wasteful action carried a whisper of warning. These beliefs may seem exaggerated today, but in a world balanced precariously between abundance and scarcity, they formed a moral code that shaped behavior for generations. Architecture too absorbed the imprint of winter. Homes were built low to the ground to trap heat. Roofs sloped steeply to shed snow before its weight could collapse them. Root cellars, sunken storage pits, and cleverly hidden underground chambers became essential features of village design. Some buildings aligned with the path of the sun to capture warmth during the darkest months. Thick walls of stone or packed earth served not only as protection from wind, but as symbols of preparedness, a physical manifestation of knowledge learned from hard winters. These designs persisted long after people forgot their original purpose, preserved because they worked, because past generations had trusted them. Social structures reflected winter's influence as well. Elders carried immense authority, not because of wealth or strength, but because of memory. They had lived through years of failed harvests, deadly storms, and famine. Their advice on how to endure the coldest months shaped the decisions of entire villages. Experienced mothers, who had kept children alive through past winters, guided younger families in rationing, mending, and preserving. Knowledge was a currency. Those who possessed it were pillars of the community. Winter humbled those who thought they could survive alone, and elevated those who understood cooperation. Even language bore the mark of scarcity. Sayings emerged from years of hardship, phrases warning against complacency, celebrating thrift, or reminding listeners that winter could return at any time. Words describing hunger took on layered meanings, used to describe not only empty stomachs, but empty spirits, empty hopes. In stories told during long nights, metaphors of cold, light, darkness, and nourishment became shorthand for emotional truths. A person described as winter-hearted was not merely cold, they carried the echoes of hardship. A child called spring-strong was a blessing, a sign of resilience emerging from a harsh season. Legends and myths grew around the cold as well. Some villages told stories of ancient spirits who controlled winter's severity, spirits who needed to be respected with offerings of food or the lighting of candles. Others spoke of heroes who brought warmth back to the land, or animals whose hibernation patterns offered omens for the coming season. These tales preserved memory in a form children could understand, teaching caution and reverence through imagery rather than instruction. The cultural impact of winter did not fade once the season ended. It shaped how people valued food, how they measured wealth, and how they treated one another. A successful harvest was not simply a victory over nature, it was a victory over fear. Communal meals weren't just celebrations, they were affirmations of survival. And rituals repeated each year were not quaint traditions, but echoes of ancestors who had endured the cold with courage. Even now, traces of this legacy remain. We feel it in the comfort of warm food on cold days, in the instinct to stock up before storms, in the quiet reverence for winter holidays that celebrate light in darkness. Modern life may have softened winter's bite, but the cultural memory persists. Yet, beyond these cultural echoes lies a quieter inheritance, the survival knowledge passed down through families, hidden within habits so old their origins blur. And it is this lingering, often invisible wisdom that forms the final thread in the story of medieval winter endurance, explored in the closing section of this chapter. Even in a world warmed by central heating and insulated walls, traces of medieval winter wisdom linger quietly beneath our daily routines. We seldom recognize them, yet they shape the choices we make in cold months, the foods we crave, and the rituals we follow without question. These subtle echoes remind us that we are not as distant from our ancestors as we imagine. Their struggles, habits, and insights flow through us like a river running beneath frozen ground, unseen but undeniably present. Consider the way we still preserve food. Canning jars lined neatly on pantry shelves, root vegetables stored in cool basements, herbs tied in small bundles to dry above kitchen counters. These are modern reflections of techniques honed through centuries of winter survival. Fermentation, once a necessity to keep vegetables edible in the deepest cold, now appears in kimchi and sauerkraut jars purchased from grocery stores, though the act itself is ancient. Even the simple habit of freezing leftovers echoes a medieval instinct. Protect what you have today in case tomorrow arrives hungrier than expected. Our language also carries shadows of past winters. Phrases like saving for a rainy day and store it away for winter emerged from a world where failure to prepare meant risking survival. Breaking bread together once represented not just companionship, but trust and agreement to share limited resources. Even the word comfort food hints at a deeper truth. Warmth, fat, broth, and salt were the pillars of nourishment for ancestors who faced cold that seeped through walls like a living thing. Today, when the days shorten and temperatures fall, many people instinctively reach for soups, stews, and hearty dishes without knowing why. They are responding to ancient patterns written quietly into the body. Winter cravings still follow the same logic. Medieval families learned through experience. Fats provide warmth, broths restore energy. Fermented foods support digestion when meals grow heavier. Spices like garlic, cinnamon, and ginger, once precious trade goods used sparingly to invigorate the winter diet, remain staples of cold weather cooking. Even the comfort found in warm drinks traces back to a time when heat itself was a form of nourishment, offering the body respite from the cold gnawing at its edges. Our seasonal rituals carry these echoes too. Lighting candles in winter, gathering with others for holiday feasts, placing greenery in homes to remind us of life. Persisting beneath the frost, these traditions were shaped by ancestors who needed light, warmth, and community to survive long nights. The instinct to gather during the darkest months, to draw closer together rather than drift apart, is a psychological inheritance from centuries when companionship increased survival odds more surely than any single meal. Even the spaces we create reveal ancient memory. We place blankets over windows in winter without thinking. We seal drafts. We rearrange rooms so seating clusters near warmth. These habits repeat the logic medieval families used when they hung thick fabrics over doorways or arranged their beds around shared hearths. Survival shaped the way people built homes, slept, stored food, and moved through their days. Those patterns, softened by time, still appear in the choices we make when cold approaches. Perhaps the most quietly enduring knowledge is the sense of caution that stirs in us when seasons change. The instinct to prepare to gather supplies, stock pantries, or check weather forecasts reflects a distant echo of the vigilance medieval families lived with every autumn. Even in a world where scarcity no longer threatens most households, the whisper remains, "Be ready. Winter is coming." Not with the same ferocity, perhaps, but with the same symbolic weight. What makes these echoes so powerful is their subtlety. We do not consciously think, "My ancestors taught me this." Yet the habits persist, shaped by generations who endured long winters with resourcefulness rather than certainty. Their resilience, carved through hardship and hope, lives on in the way we respond to cold, conserve during uncertainty, and find comfort in community. In this way, the past is not a distant land but a quiet companion. The instincts medieval families carried, awareness, caution, patience, ingenuity, still flow through our decisions. Their rituals survive in our holidays, their preservation techniques in our kitchens, their fears in our language, and their hopes in the gatherings we cherish during the darkest months of the year. As this story closes, the medieval world grows still again, its fires dimming and its fields sleeping beneath snow. Yet its lessons remain warm within us. Winter, then and now, has always been a season that reveals who we are. Creative, enduring, bound together by the desire to protect what matters most. And though the hardships of the past may seem remote, the quiet strength required to face them still flickers inside us. Carried forward like an ember, passed from one generation to the next, guiding us through whatever cold nights lie ahead.